The door to the conclave chamber was not designed for a human body. It stood 4 meters tall and 3 meters wide, carved from a single slab of crystallized asteroid rock that had been polished over 600 years of use, until it caught light like frozen smoke. The alien who opened it for me was nearly 3 meters tall himself, his secondary limbs folded neatly against his back, his primary eyes fixed on a point somewhere above my head. He had not looked at me once since I arrived at the station. None of them had. My name is Yael Doran, and I had been Earth's ambassador to the Galactic Council for 11 years. I had attended 43 formal sessions, 7 emergency hearings, and 1 memorial event for a species that died out before humanity learned to write. I had eaten food that moved on the plate, breathed recycled air that smelled of minerals and something sweet and faintly wrong, and slept in rooms where the gravity was adjusted to something the Council considered universally acceptable, but which always made my joints ache. I knew this station better than I knew my own apartment on Earth. I knew its rhythms, its shortcuts, its silences. What I did not know, walking through that door, was that I was walking into the last session where Earth would sit as a junior member. The Chamber of Accord was shaped like the inside of a nautilus shell, not by accident. The architect, a Valari designer who had died 200 years ago, believed that the natural spiral carried a kind of authority that no straight line could. Seats curved upward in concentric rings, each ring a little higher than the last, so that the center of the room, the speaking floor, always felt like the lowest point in a bowl. Every species looked down at whoever was speaking. That was also not an accident. Earth's seat was in the 4th ring, not the outermost, but close. We were not at the bottom. We were simply not near the top. For 30 years, that had been accepted as the natural order of things. We attended. We voted when it mattered. We were occasionally consulted. We were, in the careful language of galactic diplomacy, a developing member with demonstrated potential. I had always understood that phrase to mean, you are tolerated, and your tolerance is contingent on your compliance. I sat down in our seat. It was a folding chair. Not because there was no permanent seat for us. There was. Our permanent seat had been removed for renovation 3 sessions ago, and never returned. No one had explained why. I had filed 2 formal inquiries. Both were acknowledged, and neither was answered. So I brought a folding chair from the station's supply closet, set it up in our designated spot in the 4th ring, and sat down with my datapad on my knee and my hands folded in my lap, and I looked calm, because looking calm was the most important skill I had developed in 11 years. The chamber filled slowly. The Valari came in groups of 3, always. Their social structure made solitary movement feel uncomfortable for them, something about sensory feedback loops I had read about but never fully understood. The Charathi came in 2 rows of 10, moving with that uncanny synchronized precision that always made human observers feel mildly unsettled. The Kelhari delegation was 7 beings of 7 different subspecies, which was a political statement in itself. There were 114 species represented in this chamber. Humanity was one of them. Elder Soreth Vaughn took his position at the central podium at precisely the scheduled time. The Elder was the current head of the Council's executive body. Not elected, but appointed through a process so complex that I had once read the full documentation and come away understanding roughly 30% of it. He was tall even by Valari standards, nearly 4 meters, with bioluminescent patterns moving slowly along his secondary limbs in what I had learned to read as the equivalent of a formal expression. Calm, authoritative, and this morning, something else, something underneath the calm. Controlled anxiety. I had met Soreth Vaughn personally 7 times. He was not an unkind being. He was not even an unreasonable one, in many respects. He was a creature of the system, which meant he was the system's instrument as much as its leader. He believed in the Council the way some people believe in institutions, not because the institution was perfect, but because he had built his life inside it, and could not quite imagine what the alternative looked like. He opened the session without the usual recitation of attendees. That was the first sign that something was different. The recitation was tradition, older than any of the current member species' living memory. Skipping it meant speed was more important than form. I straightened slightly in my folding chair. His opening statement was delivered in Council Standard, the constructed language all members were required to learn, though its grammar was built on a Valari cognitive structure that made it slightly uncomfortable for any species with a different base neurology, mine included. I had spoken it for 11 years, and I still processed it about 2 seconds slower than a native user. That 2-second lag had never mattered much before. "This emergency session," Soreth Vaughn began, his translator bead rendering his harmonic speech into standard with the usual slight flatness, "has been called to address a matter of serious concern to the integrity of the compact. Specifically, to address the matter of Earth's submitted census of military assets, which has been found, through independent verification, to be substantially and deliberately inaccurate." The chamber did not erupt. It did something more interesting than erupt. It went through a very specific, very rapid sequence of reactions, a kind of ripple that started at the inner rings and moved outward. The species closest to the executive level had clearly been informed in advance. Their reaction was the controlled non-reaction of beings who already knew. The species in the outer rings, my neighbors, had not been told. Their reaction was genuine, a series of shifts, sounds, and movements that in 11 different species translated roughly as, "What?" I looked at Soreth Vaughn. He was looking at me. I looked back at him with the expression I had practiced in the mirror of my quarters every morning for 6 years. Open, attentive, and giving absolutely nothing away. It was the hardest expression I knew how to make. It required actively suppressing about 40 things simultaneously. The formal accusation was read in 11 languages, one after another, by a junior council official who stood at a secondary podium and spoke without inflection. In council standard it took 4 minutes. In the other 10 languages, progressively less time, since the nuances of standard tended to require more words than most organic languages. The core of it was simple. Earth had declared, in its most recent mandatory military census, a fleet of approximately 800 vessels. Independent intelligence, compiled and verified by 3 separate council member species, put the actual figure at closer to 40,000. 40,000. I sat in my folding chair and listened to the number, and I did not move. The chamber, after the reading finished, did not go quiet. It went into that particular kind of noise that large rooms make when everyone is talking at once, but no one wants to be the loudest voice in the room. A controlled chaos, a noise made of whispers that collectively amounted to a shout. Soreth Vaughn waited. He was good at waiting. It was one of the things I actually respected about him. When the noise subsided to an acceptable level, he looked at me again. The expectation in the room was palpable. I could feel it the way you feel a change in air pressure. Everyone was waiting for the human ambassador to speak, to explain, to apologize, to confess, to panic, to be, in some visible and satisfying way, caught. I raised my hand, the formal gesture for requesting the floor. Soreth Vaughn acknowledged me with a tilt of his upper limbs. I stood up. My chair was lower than every other seat in the 4th ring by about 12 centimeters, because it was a folding chair, so standing helped. I walked down to the speaking floor. The long center podium was designed for beings much taller than me, so I adjusted the secondary microphone to my height and looked out at 114 species looking down at me. "I would like to see the evidence," I said. That was all I said. I said it in council standard, slowly enough to account for the 2-second processing lag in my own head, and then I waited. The chamber went quiet in a way that was different from the earlier quiet. The earlier quiet had been anticipation. This quiet was something closer to confusion. No one, and I say this based on 11 years of attending these sessions and reading the records of the 300 sessions before that, no one had ever simply asked to see the evidence. The expected response to an accusation of this magnitude was a denial, a counter-argument, an explanation, or a request for recess. A simple, quiet request to examine the underlying data was not a response anyone had prepared for. Soreth Vaughn looked at me for a long moment. His bioluminescent patterns shifted in a way I had never seen before on his body. A kind of flickering in the lower registers that I instinctively read as thrown. He had prepared for many responses. He had not prepared for this one. "The evidence," he said slowly, "will be presented as part of the formal proceedings." "Then please proceed," I said, and walked back to my folding chair, and sat down, and folded my hands on my datapad, and looked up at him. In the 4th ring, the Valari ambassador, a younger official named Lyra, who had been in her post for only 2 years, was watching me with an expression I recognized only because I had spent a great deal of time studying Valari facial configurations. It was the expression that translated roughly as, "I did not expect that." And beneath it, something I was less certain of, something that might have been, in the most tentative reading, relief. I noted it. I filed it away. The evidence was substantial. That was the word I kept coming back to as the council's analyst, a Dean Praxis, one of the six-limbed information specialists from the Praxis Collective, began the presentation. Substantial. Not manufactured, not exaggerated for effect. Not the kind of thin intelligence dressed up in official language that I had seen used to justify political decisions in this chamber before. This was real, thorough, detailed, the kind of work that takes years to compile. Someone had been watching Earth for a very long time. The holographic projection filled the dome of the chamber, our ships, rendered in extraordinary detail, organized by class and capability and location. I looked at them and felt something that I had not expected to feel in that moment. I had expected, if this moment ever came, to feel fear or anger or the cold strategic calculation of someone working out damage control. I did not feel any of those things. I felt something closer to recognition. I knew some of those ships. Not personally, I was a diplomat, not a fleet officer, but by record, by report, by the slow accumulation of briefings and background documents and security clearances that came with my position. I knew that Earth had been building. I had known for years that we were building in ways that our official declarations did not fully reflect. I had accepted that as a fact of the world I worked in, without examining it too closely, the way you sometimes do not look directly at a light source because you know it will be too bright. Looking at the projection, I was looking directly at the light source. 40,000 ships, deployed across 17 star systems, positioned, I realized with a slow and careful clarity, at every point that mattered, not random, not just numerous. Positioned. The Dean Praxis analyst finished the presentation with a summary of capabilities, not just numbers, but weapons systems, range, speed, the estimated combat effectiveness of Earth's fleet against any current council member species in a direct engagement. The summary was delivered in a flat, professional tone, the way medical professionals deliver difficult diagnoses. Just information, just the facts of the situation as they exist. The facts of the situation were that Earth had, quietly and over the course of approximately 60 years, built one of the 3 largest military forces in the known galaxy, and had told no one. Soreth Vaughn turned to me when the presentation concluded. The chamber was quiet again, the deep, careful quiet of beings doing rapid calculations. "Ambassador Doran," he said, "you have seen the evidence." "I have," I said. "Do you dispute any element of what was presented?" I looked at the ships still hanging in the projection above us. 40,000 points of light, each one a vessel that humanity had designed and built and crewed and deployed, each one representing years of work and resources and intent. "No," I said, "I do not dispute it." The calculation was already happening around me. I could hear it in the shifting sounds of 114 species processing the same information simultaneously. Earth had lied. Earth had hidden. Earth had built something enormous and secret, and was now, apparently, not even going to deny it. The next question, written on every face and body and sensory appendage in the room, was, "What does Earth say about that?" I asked for recess. 72 hours, to consult with my government. Soreth Vaughn denied it. The clause he cited was obscure enough that I had to look it up on my datapad while he was still reading it aloud. A treaty provision invoked exactly once in the Council's recorded history, in a context I will not go into here because the specifics were different enough that I filed it mentally as a bad precedent rather than a useful one. The clause permitted immediate inquisition in cases of declared deception, where delay might allow the subject party to, and I am quoting the treaty language here, alter material conditions relevant to the proceedings. In plain language, they were afraid that if they gave us 72 hours, we might move the ships. I set my datapad down on my knee and looked at the ceiling of the chamber, where our 40,000 vessels still floated in their blue projection light. I thought about the Kalari incident. I thought about it the way I always thought about it, in pieces, because the full shape of it was too large and too heavy to hold all at once. 40,000 people on a colony ship called the Meridian Dawn, traveling a standard route through the Kalari Passage, a route that Earth had filed and cleared and been given formal permission to use. 3 Kalari warships intercepting them not as an act of aggression, officially, but as what the Council's inquiry later termed an overzealous security response to an unregistered approach vector. The ship was gone before any distress signal could be processed. 40,000 people. The Council's response had taken 11 months. The final resolution described the incident as a regrettable outcome of miscommunication during a period of territorial boundary uncertainty, and recommended that both parties participate in a joint navigation protocol review. Earth had smiled. Earth had attended the review. Earth had filed the paperwork. Earth had begun building the next morning. I had been 8 years old when the Meridian Dawn was lost. I had not known about it until I was 26, and deep into my diplomatic training. By then, there had been other incidents, not all of them as large, all of them as answered. The chamber was waiting for me. Soreth Vaughn was waiting for me. The denial of recess had been a move, a deliberate closing of the obvious exit. Now they were waiting to see what I did with nowhere obvious to go. I thought about 60 years of quiet building. I thought about people I had never met, engineers and designers and fleet commanders and resource planners, who had spent their working lives on a project that was never supposed to be seen until the right moment. I thought about what the right moment meant. I thought about whether this was it. I looked at Soreth Vaughn and I said, "Then let us proceed." And I almost smiled, but I did not. Not yet. There was still a great deal of work to do, and smiling too early was the kind of thing that made you careless. I had not come this far by being careless. The chamber settled. The session resumed. The door behind me was still slightly open. I could feel the faint draft of the corridor air against the back of my neck. And somewhere in the station, in whatever room the Council's senior officials had prepared as their deliberation space, people were trying very hard to predict what I was going to do next. They were going to be wrong. I knew that with the same certainty I knew my own heartbeat. They were going to be wrong, because they had built their predictions on 60 years of watching Earth be polite and compliant, and grateful for its seat in the fourth ring with the folding chair, and they had not updated those predictions to account for the possibility that the politeness was a different kind of strength than they had assumed. I opened my datapad. The document I needed was already there, prepared and waiting. I had been carrying it for 2 years, updating it quarterly, refining it with every session I attended, and every decision I watched the Council make. The hearing continued. I listened carefully. I answered the questions that were answerable, and declined to answer the ones that were not, politely and without explanation. I watched the room. I counted the abstentions among the species who had been asked to verify the intelligence on our fleet. 17 species had been asked. 3 had declined. 14 had participated. I noted all of them. The afternoon session was long. The Council's questions were careful and thorough, and occasionally quite clever. I gave them full credit for that. They were not incompetent. They were simply operating from an incomplete understanding of who they were talking to. When the session broke for the evening, I walked back to my quarters, through corridors that felt different than they had that morning. The light was the same. The air recyclers made the same sound. The same beings passed me in the halls, some acknowledging me, some not. But the weight of the room had shifted, the way a room shifts when someone has just said something important, and everyone is still deciding how to respond. I could feel it in the slight adjustments people made when they saw me coming. Not avoidance, not exactly. More like a recalibration. A subtle, involuntary acknowledgement that something had changed. I sat in my quarters and ate the food the station provided, dense protein blocks that tasted of nothing in particular, and looked out the viewport at the stars, and thought about my daughter back on Earth. She was 12. She wanted to study xenobiology when she got older. She had sent me a message that morning, before the session, that said only, "Hi Mum, are you okay? You look tired in your last video." She had not seen the news yet. She was in school. I sent her a message back. I said, "I am fine. I am always tired. Yes to xenobiology. Get some sleep." Then I went to sleep myself, because the next day was going to be harder than this one, and I needed to be ready for it. I was ready for it. I had been ready for it, in some sense, for 11 years. The question was never whether this day would come. The question was only what I would say when it did. I already knew what I was going to say. I had known for a long time. The second day began with someone trying to get into my quarters at 2 in the morning. It was not a break-in. The station's security was too thorough for that. It was a knock. 3 precise intervals, the kind of knock that says, "This is official, not urgent, but not ignorable either." I was already awake. I had slept for 3 hours, and then lain in the half-dark listening to the recyclers and turning the previous day's session over in my mind, like a stone you keep finding new edges on. I opened the door. It was one of the elders' aides, a young Valari, bioluminescence barely flickering, which in their physiology signals youth as much as anything else. He was carrying a physical document case, sealed with the council's formal encryption. He handed it to me without speaking, and left without being dismissed, which was unusual. Valari protocols were strict about formal dismissal. I brought the case inside and opened it on my desk. It was the full intelligence report, everything. Not the summary I had been shown in session, but the underlying data, the source documents, the compiled records, the 3 separate verification processes, several thousand pages in Council Standard, plus appendices in 6 other languages for the original source materials. They had given it to me voluntarily, in the middle of the night, without condition or comment. I made a cup of coffee from the small synthesizer in my room. Real coffee, not the alien approximation the station stocked, because I had learned in year 2 of my posting that some comforts were worth the extra weight in your personal luggage, and I sat down and I read. It took 4 hours. I did not skim. I was not a person who skimmed documents when the documents mattered. By the time the station's artificial morning cycle began, and the corridor lights shifted from overnight amber to daytime white, I had read everything. I had a full picture of what the council knew, how they knew it, and, most usefully, what they thought the implications were. They were wrong about the implications. Not in every respect, but in the important ones. They had looked at our fleet and seen threat. That was understandable. Any species looking at 40,000 warships belonging to a species they had been underestimating for 60 years would see threat. The mistake was in thinking that threat was the whole story. Threat was the visible surface. What lay underneath it was something more complicated, and something that I suspected at least some of them already knew, if they were willing to admit it to themselves. I showered. I dressed. I ate something that was not coffee, and was not good. I put the intelligence report back in its case, resealed it, and carried it with me to the morning session. I set it on the edge of the podium where everyone could see it. Soreth Vaughn noticed immediately. His bioluminescent patterns ran a quick ripple. Surprise. Controlled. He had not expected me to bring the report into the chamber. Bringing it into the chamber meant I had read it. Reading it in full in one night was not something any of his advisors had apparently predicted I would do. Good. The morning session opened with a resumption of the formal inquiry. I sat in my folding chair in the 4th ring and listened to the Council's deputy analyst present additional context on Earth's military development. Specifically, the timeline, how the buildup had begun, when the first signs had appeared, what intelligence had been gathered at each stage, and what had been done with it. This was the part I had been waiting for, because the timeline the deputy analyst presented was accurate as far as it went. Earth had begun its accelerated fleet development approximately 61 years ago. What the analyst did not address, what the official presentation carefully, professionally, completely avoided, was the question of what had happened 62 years ago. I raised my hand. I was given the floor. I walked to the podium. The timeline presented, I said, begins in year 61. I would like to ask the council, what happened in year 62? The room went very still. Year 62 was the Kalari incident. Everybody in this chamber knew it. Several of the delegates in the inner rings had been alive when it happened. Some of them had voted on the resolution that followed it. The resolution that described the deaths of 40,000 people as a regrettable outcome of miscommunication. Soreth Vaughn said, carefully, "The Council does not see the relevance of historical incidents to the current inquiry." "Then I will explain the relevance," I said, and I opened my data pad. What followed was not a speech. I am not a speech giver by nature. Speeches imply a single sustained arc with a beginning, middle, and destination. What I gave was a reading. A slow, careful, sequential reading of the official council record, every incident involving Earth over the past century, with its official date, the parties involved, and the Council's official response. I had compiled this document myself over 5 years. I updated it every 6 months. It was the most important document I possessed. It began with minor things. Trade disputes where Council arbitration had consistently ruled against Earth, not because Earth's case was weaker, but because our member status carried less weight in arbitration panels, where the deciding voices belonged to species who traded more with our opponents than with us. Navigational permits denied or delayed in ways that cost our shipping companies months and significant resources. Resource claim rejections in newly mapped sectors that were subsequently approved for species who had applied later but carried more political weight. These were the small frictions of a junior member. I did not present them as atrocities. They were not atrocities. They were the daily reality of operating in a political system designed by species who had been operating in it for centuries, before humanity arrived, and who had spent those centuries arranging things to suit themselves. That was not surprising. It was not even particularly unfair by the standards of how power tends to work. What mattered was the pattern. I read through 20 incidents. The room was quiet in the way it gets when people are listening more carefully than they want to be. I could see it in postures and body language across 114 species, the slight forward lean, the stilled secondary limbs, the cessation of the small background movements that beings make when they are only half attending. I read through 30. At Incident 31, the passage writes revocation of 44 years ago, when Earth's established navigation corridor through the outer rim was unilaterally reclassified as restricted space without notice, leaving 14 of our deep-range science vessels stranded for 8 months. While the Council processed our appeal, I heard a sound from the third ring, a brief, soft sound that in Valari physiology corresponds to something between discomfort and recognition. I looked up. The Valari ambassador, Lyra, was looking at her datapad. Her secondary limbs were very still. I continued reading. Incident 39 was the Kalari incident. I read the official record entry as it appeared in the Council's own archive. The date, the location, the number of casualties, 40,000 people, the name of the ship, the Council's 11-month inquiry process and its conclusion, the joint navigation review, the final formal note that the matter was considered resolved. Resolved. I read the word. I let it sit in the air of the chamber for exactly as long as it needed to sit there, and then I moved to Incident 40. By Incident 47, which was the most recent entry, the chamber had undergone a visible change. It was difficult to quantify. I was not reading the room out of anxiety, but out of professional habit, the way you keep checking your instruments not because you distrust them, but because checking them is simply what you do. The change was not guilt, exactly. Most of the beings in this room had not personally done any of what I was reading. It was something more collective, a species-level discomfort, the specific unease of a room full of people who have just been made to look at something they had individually and collectively agreed not to look at. I set down my datapad. I am not here to confess, I said. I am here to inform this Council that Earth was not deceiving you. We were simply not showing you every aspect of our position in a game that has been played against us for a century. The silence that followed was a different quality from any silence I had heard in this chamber before. It was the silence of a room where the architecture of a conversation has just been completely altered, and no one has yet found the new load-bearing walls. Soreth Vaughn spoke first. He was, as I have said, not an unintelligent being. He understood immediately that the ground had shifted. His opening response was measured. The Council acknowledges Ambassador Doran's statement. We note, however, that the record she has presented, while factually accurate in its citations, does not address the fundamental question of disclosure. With respect, I said, it does. It addresses why disclosure, as structured by the Compact's terms, was not in Earth's best interest to provide. And it establishes a pattern of behavior by Council member species that constitutes context for Earth's decisions. Context does not negate obligation. No, I agreed. It does not, but it does inform how obligation is weighed against survival. That word landed differently than the others. Survival. It was not a dramatic word, and I had not spoken it dramatically. I had spoken it the way you speak a fact, because that was what it was. A fact about how Earth had understood its situation for 60 years. Not a complaint, not an accusation. A statement of the calculation that had been running, quietly, in the background of everything Earth had done since the Kalari incident. Soreth Vaughn was quiet for a moment. His bioluminescence ran a pattern I had not studied enough to fully interpret. Then he said, "We will recess for 1 hour." During the recess, I stayed on the speaking floor. I had nowhere else I particularly wanted to go, and staying was its own kind of statement. I was not anxious. I was not strategizing. I was simply here. A junior aide brought me water in a container sized for a human hand. I thanked her in Valari, which surprised her. Most human ambassadors did not speak Valari. It was considered too difficult, the harmonic requirements too demanding for human vocal architecture. I had been learning it for 9 years. I was not good at it, but I was understandable, which had often been enough. During that hour, several things happened. 3 council delegates came to the edge of the speaking floor and looked at me from a distance. They did not approach. They looked, and then they left. I recognized 2 of them, Charathi senior officials, both of them old enough to have been present for the Kalari incident vote. I did not know what their looking meant. I filed it. 1 delegate did approach. A Praxis Collective member, not the analyst, but one of the senior delegates, a being with 6 limbs and a face that to human perception always looked mildly startled. She came close enough to speak quietly, below the range of the chamber's general audio pickup, and she said in passable council standard, "Your compilation of incidents is accurate. We have a similar one." She said nothing else and went back to her seat. I thought about that for the rest of the recess. When Soreth Vaughn returned, his first question was the one I had expected. What does Earth intend to do with the fleet it has built? It was the obvious question. It was the question everyone in the room had been waiting for, because it was the question the answer to which would determine everything that came next. Was this a threat? An ultimatum? A slow build-up to some demand? What did Earth want? I looked at him. I looked at the chamber. I looked at 114 species looking at me from their tiered seats. "Nothing," I said. Soreth Vaughn's bioluminescence flickered rapidly. "Nothing?" "Nothing aggressive," I clarified. "Nothing against the council or its members. The fleet exists for the same reason any species builds a fleet, because the galaxy is large, and the alternative to having one is being at the mercy of everyone who does." The room processed that. It was a simple statement. Its simplicity made it harder to argue with, which was intentional. Then why the concealment? "Because we did not trust the council's response to knowing," I said. "That is not an accusation. It is a statement about the information we had at the time, which suggested, based on historical precedent, that a junior member declaring significant military capability, without council sanction, would be met with restrictions rather than acknowledgement." I paused. Was that assessment incorrect? The silence that followed was its own answer. I let it be its own answer for exactly as long as the room needed to sit in it. Then I sat down and waited for the afternoon session to begin. Outside the chamber, in whatever room the council's senior advisors were meeting in at that moment, I knew the conversation was changing. It had to be. The morning session had not gone the way they planned. The afternoon session was going to be worse for them, or better, depending on how you looked at it. I was not particularly concerned about their comfort. I was concerned about getting this right. There was a difference between making a point and achieving an outcome, and the point mattered less to me than the outcome. The point was for this room, for the record, for the future historians who would read the transcripts of this session and understand what had happened here. The outcome was for Earth, for the 40,000 people who were already dead, and the uncountable number who were still alive, and still needed a planet that could negotiate from something other than a folding chair. My datapad held 3 more documents I had not yet shown anyone. I looked at them briefly. Their titles, not their contents. I knew their contents by heart. I thought about the order in which things would need to happen, and whether the timing felt right, and decided that it did not feel right yet. There was more conversation still to be had, more of the room still to understand. I drank the rest of my water. I looked at the ship still hanging faintly in the dome projection, because no one had cleared it. A small oversight that I thought was perhaps not entirely accidental. They wanted to see if the ships made me nervous. They did not make me nervous. They made me feel something much quieter and much harder to name. Something like the weight of a long time coming to a point. Something like standing at the end of a corridor you have been walking down your entire professional life and realizing you have finally reached the door. I was not afraid of the door. I had been trained by people who believed that fear was information, not instruction. I had taken that lesson seriously. The information that fear was giving me right now was, this matters. This is the moment that the next 60 years will be built on. Yes, I thought. I know. The afternoon session began. I was ready for it. There was a moment, approximately 40 minutes into the afternoon session, when I understood that the council was not going to let this conclude the way it had begun. They had started the day expecting confession, denial, or confrontation. What they had received instead was something quieter and more difficult to process. Accountability without apology. I had not told them they were wrong to investigate. I had not told them they had no right to questions. I had simply shown them the weight of what their questions sat on top of, and waited for them to feel that weight. Some of them were feeling it. That was visible, in the careful way they phrased the afternoon's questions, more softly, more obliquely, as if they were trying to approach the subject from an angle that did not require them to directly engage with the morning's reading. Soreth Vaughn was the most skilled at this. He was a good politician. He kept the session moving in directions that were productive for the council's position, without directly engaging with the record I had read. But the other 46 delegates who asked questions in the afternoon were less skilled, and 4 of them, I counted, did something that was technically outside the session's format, but not technically against the rules. They asked questions that were not about Earth's fleet at all. They asked about the council's own processes, about how member disputes were handled, about what mechanisms existed for junior members to raise concerns about treatment, about whether the Joint Navigation Review following the Kalari incident had produced any binding changes to protocol. The answers to all 4 of those questions, provided by the council's own record keepers, were not flattering. By the time the afternoon session ended, I had not been charged with anything. I had not agreed to anything. I had simply spent a day in a room with 114 species, reading them their own history, and letting the silence speak for the parts of it that the words could not carry. Walking back to my quarters, I passed the Valari ambassador in the corridor. She was alone, which was unusual. She stopped when she saw me. We had never spoken privately before. Protocol was strict about unofficial contact during formal proceedings. She looked at me for a long moment, and then she said, in Valari, which she clearly did not expect me to understand, "You are going to do something tomorrow that changes everything." In Valari, I said, "I know." She blinked. Both sets of eyelids, in sequence, the Valari equivalent of a startled pause. Then she walked on. I went back to my quarters. I updated my documents. I set an alarm for 5 in the morning. Tomorrow was going to be the hardest day, and the most important one, and I was not going to spend it tired. The vote happened faster than I expected. I had anticipated a full day of proceedings, more questions, more presentations, perhaps a second round of formal inquiry, before the council moved to resolution. They surprised me. By mid-morning, they had called a procedural recess, and returned 40 minutes later, with a unified motion already drafted. 97 to 14, with 17 abstentions. The motion to formally sanction Earth passed before noon. Trade frozen. Fleet disarmament required within 180 days. Earth's council seat suspended pending full disclosure of all military assets and a restructured census process under joint council oversight. I sat in my folding chair and listened to the clerk read the resolution aloud, and I felt, for the first time in 3 days, something sharp and clear-cut through the professional composure I had been maintaining. Not fear, not anger, something more precise than either of those. Something like watching a very old, very predictable machine finish exactly the motion it was designed to complete, and feeling the particular combination of satisfaction and sadness that comes from having been right about something you did not want to be right about. They had voted exactly the way I had predicted they would vote, 2 years ago, when I first began drafting the documents I was carrying. I looked at the 14 who had voted no. I had counted the votes as they were recorded. 14 species had voted against the sanction. I knew some of them by their patterns. The Charathi delegation, the 2 Praxis collective representatives, a handful of smaller member species from the Outer Rim sectors. Beings who had, over the past century, found themselves on the uncomfortable side of council majority decisions, often enough to have developed a certain wariness about what unanimous action by the inner ring tended to produce. I looked at the 17 abstentions. Abstention in council proceedings was not cowardice. It was a specific political instrument, a way of saying, I am not voting for this, but I am not strong enough to vote against it. The 17 abstentions told me something important about the fault lines in this room. Soreth Vaughn read the resolution's final clause, which required Earth's ambassador to formally acknowledge receipt of the sanction and confirm readiness to comply with the disclosure requirements. It was a formality. It had always been a formality. Every species sanctioned by the Council in the past 3 centuries had acknowledged receipt and complied. That was simply how this worked. He looked at me. My datapad was open to the document I had been carrying for 2 years, the one I updated quarterly, the one I had shown no one. I stood up. The chamber was quiet in the specific way it gets when a formality is about to be completed. A ready quiet. A we already know what comes next quiet. I walked to the podium. I adjusted the microphone. I looked out at the chamber. The government of Earth, I said, acknowledges receipt of the Council's resolution. Soreth Vaughn's upper limbs relaxed fractionally. Good. Let him relax. Let the room relax. Let them have that half-second of relief. We acknowledge receipt, I continued, and in response, formally and permanently withdraw Earth's membership from the Galactic Compact, effective immediately. The room did not erupt. I want to be precise about this because the word erupt implies a single unified response, and what happened was nothing like that. What happened was that 114 species registered the same information at different speeds and with different physiologies and through different translation systems, which meant that the reaction moved through the chamber in a wave, starting with the inner ring delegates who processed standard fastest, spreading outward through the middle rings, reaching the outer ring where I had been sitting for 11 years, in a folding chair perhaps 3 full seconds after it hit the center. Those 3 seconds were extraordinary. I stood at the podium and watched the wave move through the room, and I kept my face completely still, because the moment you let your expression change in a room like this one, the expression becomes the story. The words I had said were simple. I want to be clear about what they meant, because there are people who have since described what I did that day as walking out, or storming out, or refusing to engage. None of those descriptions are accurate. Walking out implies impulse, emotion, a reaction to something that has just happened. What I did was not a reaction. It had been planned for 2 years, updated quarterly, refined through 43 sessions of watching this council operate. Withdrawing was not a moment of anger. It was the conclusion of a long and careful assessment of whether Earth's interests were better served inside the compact or outside it. The assessment said, outside. The math was not simple, but the conclusion was. I left the speaking floor. I walked up through the rings toward the exit, past the 4th ring, where my folding chair sat empty, past the 3rd ring, past the 2nd. The noise of the chamber had reached a level that the building's acoustic systems were clearly not designed for. I could not make out individual words. I could hear the overall shape of the sound. Alarm, confusion, some anger, and beneath all of it, the particular frequency that large rooms make when the people in them are recalculating. I was at the chamber door when I heard Soreth Vaughn's voice cut through the noise. Amplified, sharp, still controlled but only barely. Ambassador Doran. I stopped. I turned. He was standing at the central podium, looking at me from across the entire length of the chamber. His bioluminescent patterns were doing something I had never seen before. A rapid, complex sequence that I could not read, but which, based on the reactions of every Valari in the room, was clearly significant. This body has not adjourned, he said. Protocol requires. I am aware of the protocol, I said, my voice carried without the microphone. The acoustic design of the chamber worked in both directions. Earth is no longer a compact member. Compact protocol no longer governs my conduct in this chamber. I wish you and the council a productive session. I went through the door. The corridor beyond was empty, except for 2 of the Valari honor guards who had escorted me in 3 days ago. They were standing very still. They both looked at me. For the first time since I arrived, they met my eyes. I walked. The station's main corridor was 200 meters long, lit in the amber and white combination that the compact had selected as the universal neutral lighting standard. Bright enough for species that relied on visible light, muted enough for species that were more sensitive. My footsteps echoed in a way that told me the corridor was emptier than it usually was at this time of day. People had been watching the session. Most of them were still watching. I was 40 meters from the chamber door when I heard footsteps behind me. I kept walking. I did not speed up, and I did not slow down. I listened to the footsteps. 1 set, then 2, then, I counted, 8, then more. I stopped walking. Not because I was unsure where I was going, but because I had promised myself I would stop and face this moment, rather than letting it happen behind me. There was a difference between leading and running, and I had spent my entire career on the right side of that line. I turned. 14 delegates were in the corridor. Not all of them. Some were still visible through the gap in the chamber door, looking out. But 14 were here, in the corridor, behind me. The same 14 who had voted no. The Charathi were there. Their 2 rows reduced now to 4. The others apparently still inside, but the 4 senior representatives were here. The 2 Praxis Collective members were here. The Valari ambassador, Lyra, was here, and she was not walking with the careful deliberateness of someone following protocol. She was moving quickly, almost urgently, and her secondary limbs were extended in the configuration I had read in my studies as open expression, the Valari equivalent of not hiding. She reached me first. She was carrying something. A physical document case, sealed, the kind you use for original records that cannot be digitally transmitted. She held it out to me with both primary hands, which in Valari culture is a gesture reserved for exchanges of significant weight. We have kept records too, she said, in Valari and then in Standard for the benefit of the others gathering around us. Every vote, every decision, every time we were outvoted by the inner ring, on matters involving Earth and others in the outer system. We voted no when we could. We abstained when we could not. We always knew it was not enough. She did not look away. We were afraid of what saying that out loud would cost us. We are saying it now. I took the case. It was heavier than it looked. The Charathi elder, the oldest of the 4 who had followed me out, a being whose age I could not accurately estimate but which, based on the formal markings on his carapace, was measured in centuries, spoke in a careful, deliberate standard that indicated he had translated from his native syntax, rather than using a translator bead. Our species has been supplying your deep-range vessels with navigational data for 41 years. Unofficially, outside official channels, we believed you would need it. We did not know when. We suspected a day like this one might come, and we chose which side we would stand on, long before it arrived. I looked at him. I looked at the group of beings around me in this corridor. I thought about 41 years of unofficial navigational data quietly fed to human vessels, through channels no one had flagged or reported, or brought to the Council's attention. I thought about the Valari's records of their own votes. I thought about the 2 Praxis Collective representatives, standing quietly at the edge of the group, their multiple limbs folded in a posture I read as waiting. What did you expect to happen today? I asked. The question was genuine. The Charathi elder was quiet for a moment. Then, we expected what happened. We have been expecting it for some years. The question was always whether Earth would actually do it, or whether the cost would seem too high at the last moment. And now that we have? Now, he said, the galaxy decides what it thinks about what you have done. And every species in that chamber decides which side of that decision to stand on. I looked back at the chamber door. Through the gap I could see the chamber was still in full noise. I could hear it from here, a sustained complex sound like an orchestra that had not yet found its key. Inside that sound, I knew, were people making calculations, economic calculations, political calculations, strategic calculations, trying to determine what Earth's withdrawal meant, for trade routes, for treaty obligations, for the balance of influence they had built over centuries, trying to determine whether this was a moment they should have prevented or a moment they could manage. I knew what their calculations were going to find. I had run the same calculations, very carefully, over the course of 2 years. The answer was not comfortable for the Council. I thought about sending a message to Earth's Secretary General. I had 3 words ready. I had prepared 3 words to send when this moment came, because brevity in a message sent at a moment like this was its own form of confidence. 3 words that said, I did it. Now prepare. Then my datapad chimed. A message incoming, routed through the Earth Embassy channel, marked urgent. It was from the Secretary General. 3 words. We saw it. I almost smiled. 2 years of preparation, and the woman had beaten me to the message. In the corridor, around me, 14 species were waiting. Not for orders. They were not mine to command. They were waiting for what came next, for the shape of the thing that was beginning to form in the space that Earth's withdrawal had opened up. I thought about the secondary accord documents I had drafted 18 months ago and never shown anyone. The framework for a different kind of compact, smaller, more carefully structured, built on the specific and honest acknowledgement that different species had different interests, and that the Council's model of pretending otherwise had produced, over a century, exactly the outcomes you would expect from that pretension. It was not a perfect document. I had not intended it to be perfect. Perfect documents tend to be too rigid to survive contact with reality. I had intended it to be honest and functional and built on a foundation of what beings had actually demonstrated they were willing to do for each other, rather than what they had claimed in treaty language they were willing to do. I said to the Valari ambassador, "I have a document you should read." Lyra said, "I thought you might." Behind us, deeper in the corridor, I heard more footsteps. More delegates, coming out of the chamber in ones and twos, some following, some simply moving in the same direction, because the direction of movement in a building shifts when enough people move the same way. I did not look back. I had learned long ago that looking back was fine, as long as it was to understand, not to hesitate. I understood what was behind me. I knew what was ahead of me, in broad terms. The specifics were still being written, by all of us, in real time, in a corridor on an alien space station, while a chamber full of other beings tried to calculate what the changed shape of the galaxy meant for their interests. The answer, I thought, was going to depend significantly on what we did next, which meant it was time to stop standing in corridors and start working. I started walking again. This time, I heard footsteps match mine from the very first step. The conference room the station provided was technically assigned to the Charathi delegation. Their elder released it without hesitation, directing 2 of the younger delegates to clear it of the Charathi's personal equipment, with an efficiency that told me he had been thinking about this contingency for some time. Within 20 minutes, 14 species were seated around a table that had not been designed with that specific combination of physiologies in mind, and I was standing at the head of it, with my datapad open to the secondary accord document. "This is not final," I said, before anyone could ask. "It is a framework, a starting point, built on 2 premises that I am going to state plainly before we read a single clause, because I believe plainness is what this particular moment requires." No one objected to plainness. I had chosen the right room for it. The first premise is that the Galactic Compact, as currently structured, serves the interests of its longest-standing members at the expense of its newer ones. This is not a moral claim. It is a structural observation. Institutions built by species with centuries of galactic experience will reflect the priorities of those species. This is not unusual. It is, in fact, predictable. Around the table, various forms of acknowledgement, some vocal, some gestural. One species, the Thressi, a group I had not encountered much personally, expressed agreement through a brief color change in their outer dermal layer. I noted it, noted that I needed to learn more about Thressi communication patterns, and continued. The second premise is that the species in this room have demonstrated, through their voting records and through unofficial cooperation with Earth and with each other, a consistent pattern of values that the Compact's majority does not share. This is also not a moral claim. It is a pattern I have tracked for 5 years, and which the documents several of you have just offered me confirm. I looked at the Valari case, sitting at the edge of the table where Lyra had placed it. I looked at the Charathi elder. I looked at the quiet Praxis delegates. What I am proposing is not a replacement for the Compact. It is a secondary structure, smaller, more honest about what it is and what it can do, based on trade and navigation agreements that have actual enforcement mechanisms rather than the Compact's current model of strong resolutions and inconsistent follow-through. The Praxis delegate who had spoken to me during the recess, I still did not know her name, I realized, said, "You have been preparing this for some time." 2 years of drafting, I said. 5 years of research before that. She was quiet for a moment. doing whatever internal processing the Praxis Collective used for decisions. Then, read it to us. So I did. It took an hour and a half. We discussed every clause. We argued about 4 of them. We reached agreement on 3 of those 4, and tabled the 4th for a second session. By the time the station's day cycle reached its evening point, we had a working draft that 7 of the 14 species were ready to sign provisionally, pending home government confirmation. 7. From a starting point of 0. In a single afternoon, in a conference room borrowed from the Charathi. It was not everything. It was a beginning. Outside the room, through the corridor walls and the station's layers of insulation, and the vast political machinery of the compact, the Elder and his inner ring were doing their own work. I could not hear it. I did not need to. I had spent 11 years learning to predict the shape of decisions before they were announced, and the shape I was predicting now was panic, dressed in the language of procedure. They would call it an unprecedented breach of compact integrity. They would move to formalize Earth's withdrawal as a hostile act. They would invite Earth to reconsider, in language carefully designed to feel like an invitation rather than a request. And when they looked at the figures, the trade figures, the navigation figures, the careful geography of which hyperspace corridors ran through Earth-claimed territory, they would reach the conclusion that was already sitting there waiting for them, the one that Earth had known for 30 years and had never mentioned. They would reach it tonight, or tomorrow morning. It would not be a comfortable realization, but it would be a clarifying one. I was counting on the clarity. The request came at 3 in the morning, station time. Not a knock this time, a formal communication through the Earth Embassy channel, routed from Soreth Vaughn's personal office to mine. I was awake. I had slept 2 hours, and spent the other 6 organizing the secondary accord drafts, cataloging the documents Lyra had given me, and beginning the very long process of sending briefing packages back to Earth's government, Earth's Military Oversight Committee, and 3 individuals in Earth's intelligence community, who had been expecting my message for a year. The communication was short. The Council requests a private meeting at Ambassador Doran's earliest convenience. No formal record. No translators beyond personal devices. I read it twice. Then I read the language again more carefully. Requests, not summons. Not demands, requests. And Ambassador Doran, rather than Earth's representative. The latter was the official language for a party who had withdrawn, the phrasing the Compact's protocol used when it needed to address someone who was technically no longer a member. Ambassador Doran was informal, personal, a choice of language that said, "We are reaching out to you as a person, not as an institution." The distinction mattered. Protocol language creates distance and maintains hierarchy. Personal language, choosing to use a name rather than a title, choosing a request over a requirement, was a form of lowering the defensive wall. It did not mean the wall was gone. It meant someone had decided the wall was not serving them well at this particular moment. I sent back, tomorrow morning, 800 hours, my current conference room. The reply came in 4 minutes. Agreed. I made more coffee. I went back to work. Morning arrived the way mornings do on space stations, not with light, which is artificial and on a schedule, but with the sound of more people in the corridors. The station's population followed a rhythm regardless of species, shaped by the work cycles that all members observed, because the Compact's founding documents had standardized them across member species, on the grounds that synchronized work periods facilitated communication and trade. A decision made 400 years ago by beings who had never imagined that one of the species they were standardizing schedules for would not yet be spacefaring at the time of writing. The conference room. 800 hours. Soreth Vaughn arrived exactly on time, accompanied by 2 senior council advisors, beings I knew by sight but not well, one Valari and one Karathi, both from the inner ring's administrative structure rather than the member delegation. The choice of advisors was itself a message. These were operational people, not political ones, people who dealt with how things actually worked, rather than what they officially meant. I had 2 people with me, Owen Clark, Earth Station Attaché, who had been with me for 6 years, and knew how to sit in a room and take precise mental notes without appearing to do anything at all, and Vera Nault, our economic analyst, who had flown in from the Earth Embassy on the nearest inhabited planet 14 hours ago, and had spent those 14 hours reviewing trade data. I had asked Vera specifically because the conversation I expected was going to turn on economics very quickly, and I did not want to be in the position of working from memory when Soreth Vaughn had advisors who worked with the figures daily. We sat. No formal opening. Soreth Vaughn looked at me across the table and said, "What would it take for Earth to remain in association with the Compact?" I let the question sit for one breath. One full breath. Slow, the way you breathe when you want your voice to come out level. "I have a document," I said. I passed it across the table. Not my data pad, a physical printout, because physical documents feel different when you receive them. They have weight. They require hands. The act of holding them changes how you read. Soreth Vaughn took it. His advisors leaned to look. The document was 14 pages. The clauses were written in plain council standard with no legal obfuscation, because I had spent considerable effort stripping out the language that usually made treaty documents impenetrable. I wanted every clause to be immediately understandable. I wanted no one to be able to read it and claim later that they had not understood what they were agreeing to. I watched Soreth Vaughn read. He was a fast reader. His eye pattern moved in the Valari way, which processed information in lateral sweeps rather than the top-to-bottom linear scan that humans used, and which was considerably more efficient for dense textual information. He was through the first 4 pages before his Charathi advisor had finished page 2. On page 6, he stopped. He looked up at me. His bioluminescence was very still, the still that precedes significant speech. "This gives Earth veto authority over any council resolution affecting human-inhabited space." "Yes." "And a co-governing seat at the executive level." "Yes." "And removes all fleet disclosure requirements in perpetuity." "Yes." He set the document down. These terms would effectively make Earth a co-authority within the Compact. "Yes," I said, for the 4th time. He looked at his advisors. The Valari advisor's face was unreadable to me. I did not know her well enough. The Charathi advisor was doing something with his secondary limbs that I read as, "This is the conversation I expected, and I have thoughts about it." Soreth Vaughn said, "Why should the council accept these terms?" It was a direct question, and it deserved a direct answer. "Because the alternative costs you more." "Explain." I nodded to Vera. She opened her datapad and began to speak in the careful, slightly flat tone of someone who is not a politician, but who has learned that presenting numbers clearly is its own form of argument. She laid out the trade dependency figures first. What percentage of the Compact's total annual trade volume passed through Earth-controlled navigation corridors? Then the infrastructure figures, the relay stations, the communication nodes, the deep-range fuel depots that Earth had built over 60 years in the spaces between inhabited systems, in the gaps that the older species had never bothered to fill, because the gaps had seemed too far from anything that mattered at the time. 60 years ago, those gaps had not mattered to anyone but Earth. They mattered now. The Compact's inner ring had expanded, colonies had spread, trade routes had lengthened, and the infrastructure that kept those routes viable, a significant portion of it was ours. Not all of it. Enough of it. Vera finished. The room was quiet with the specific quality of beings processing unwelcome mathematics. Soreth Vaughn said, "Some of those installations are in neutral space." "Yes," I said, "they are. We built them there legally, with the appropriate Compact permits, at a time when the Compact was pleased to have someone filling infrastructure gaps it did not want to pay for. The permits are all filed. The maintenance records are all current. Everything was done correctly. Their continued operation is entirely at Earth's discretion," I said. "We maintain them because we have found it beneficial to do so. The terms in that document would give the Council formal guarantees of continued operation as part of the new association framework. Outside those terms, the guarantees would not exist. I did not say we would shut them down. I did not say it because I did not need to. The Compact's advisors were fully capable of completing that sentence themselves. What I was offering them was not a threat. I want to be precise about that. It was a description of a reality. The reality was that infrastructure controlled by an entity outside your political framework is infrastructure you cannot rely on indefinitely. The terms I was offering changed that. The terms converted a vulnerability into a partnership. It was, if you looked at it honestly, a better deal for the Compact than the status quo they had been operating under, because at least under the terms of the document, they would have formal guarantees. What they would not have was the comfortable fiction they had maintained for 60 years, that Earth was a junior member, manageable, dependent, grateful for its seat in the fourth ring. That fiction was gone. I had not taken it away. The 60 years of quiet construction that preceded my appointment had taken it away. I had simply been the person standing in the room when the accounting finally came due. Soreth Vaughn looked at the document for a long time. His two advisors had a quiet, brief exchange in Valari that I did not catch fully. Something about timelines and the executive committee, which told me they were already thinking about implementation rather than refusal. That was significant. "You do not discuss implementation of terms you intend to reject," he said. "I will need to present this to the full executive committee." "Of course," I said. "I will give you 72 hours. "That may not be." "It is sufficient," I said. "The document is not complex. The decisions it requires are not technical. They are political, and political decisions at the executive level should not take longer than 72 hours, unless the people making them are stalling. I do not believe this executive committee is in a position to afford stalling." His bioluminescence flickered. Not anger. I had learned to distinguish the frequency of his anger from other patterns over 11 years. This was something else. Something that might, in a human face, have appeared as a rueful acknowledgement. Something that said, "You are right, and we both know you are right, and we are going to proceed as if you did not say it quite so directly." He stood. His advisors stood. He extended his primary limbs toward me. Both of them, the formal gesture of acknowledgement between equals, which was not a gesture he had used with Earth's representatives before. Ever. Not once in recorded session history. I extended mine. 72 hours, I said. 72 hours, he agreed. They left. Owen closed the door behind them. He turned to me and said, in the mild tone he used for observations that were less mild than they sounded, "That went exactly the way you predicted." "Almost," I said. I expected him to push back more on the fleet clause. He read ahead. He knew the fleet clause was coming before he got there. "Yes," I said. "I know." I had seen his eyes move. He had read to page 11 before coming back to page 6. He had seen the full shape of the document before engaging with any part of it. That was the behavior of a careful mind, and it told me that whatever the executive committee's deliberations produced over the next 72 hours, they would be based on a clear understanding of what we were offering and what we were not. I sent my message to Earth's Secretary General. 4 words this time. 72 hours. Prepare everything. Her reply came in 6 minutes. Already done. How are you? I typed, tired. Fine. She sent back, sleep. I did not sleep. I had too much to do. But I thought about it, which I have sometimes found is almost as useful. The 72 hours began. During those 72 hours, 2 things happened that I had not predicted. The first was that 4 additional council member species, 3 from the outer ring and 1 from the middle ring, which surprised me considerably, sent private communications to Owen's channel requesting informal meetings. Not with the council. With me, specifically. All 4 cited mutual interest in emerging association frameworks. 2 of them attached preliminary trade data to their messages, which was either very forward-thinking or a signal that they had been waiting for exactly this moment. I scheduled 3 of the meetings and declined the 4th. The Kelhari delegation, whose inner political dynamics I understood well enough to know that meeting with them, without a clear sense of their senior faction's position, would be more likely to generate complications than progress. I sent them a polite acknowledgement and said I would be pleased to continue the conversation in a more structured setting, which was diplomatic language for, not yet, but the door is not closed. The second thing that happened was that Lyra came to see me alone. She arrived at my quarters at a time that was clearly chosen to be outside anyone's official monitoring schedule, late enough in the rest cycle that the corridor cameras would show nothing unusual, early enough that the day staff had not yet come on shift. She knocked the same 3-interval knock that the Elder's aide had used 2 nights ago, which I was beginning to think was a station-wide code I had simply not been trained in. I opened the door. She was not carrying anything this time. She looked, for the first time since I had met her, like she was not performing a role. The careful professional composure that all ambassadors of long-standing develop was gone, or at least set to one side. She looked like a person who had made a significant decision and was in the brief window between making it and having to live with it. She said, "I have spent 2 days reading the secondary accord draft. Owen sent it to you." "At my request, yes." She paused. "My government has been monitoring these proceedings. They contacted me 6 hours ago. They would like to know if the accord is still accepting provisional signatures." I looked at her for a moment. The Volari were not a small species. They were not politically insignificant, and they were not without influence in the inner ring, which was precisely why their presence at the council was complicated. They were large enough to matter, but not powerful enough to be truly safe without alignment with the majority. Moving away from that majority was a risk of a kind that most species in their position would not take lightly. "It is still accepting provisional signatures," I said. She exhaled. "In Volari, that meant something different than it does in human physiology. It was a deliberate release, a controlled signal of settling. Then we would like to sign." I brought her inside. I poured her the beverage I kept specifically for Volari guests, a mineral compound that their chemistry processed the way humans process caffeine. I opened my datapad to the accord document. She read the signature clause carefully, which I respected. She did not sign quickly or without reading. When she signed, she said, "There will be 8 of us when the others decide. Perhaps 10. 8 is enough to make it real," I said. "And the council? Will accept Earth's terms or will not. Either way, the accord exists. Either way, the structure changes." She looked at me with the expression I still read imperfectly but was learning. The multi-layered Volari look that held several things simultaneously. "You always knew it would go this way." "I knew it could," I said. "There is a difference. I knew the conditions existed for it to go this way. I did not know whether the beings involved would choose to move toward it or away from it. What if we had not followed you out of the chamber?" I had thought about that. Not often, but I had thought about it. The honest answer was uncomfortable. Then it would have been harder. Much harder. Earth would still have withdrawn. That decision was not contingent on anyone else's choice. But the accord required other species to decide their interests were better served outside the compact's current structure. If no one had made that decision, I would have spent the next several years building toward a different kind of approach. A slower one. A slower one, yes. I paused. I am grateful it was not slower. She made the sound that the translator rendered as something close to a quiet laugh, though the Volari version did not carry the same involuntary quality. It was a deliberate expression of something warm. "We are grateful too," she said. "We have been grateful in advance for some time. We were simply not certain the moment would come." She left before the corridor cameras came back on schedule. I stood in my doorway for a moment after she was gone, looking at the empty corridor, and then I went back inside and looked at the signature on the accord document. 8 provisional members, now. When I had drafted the document, I had told myself that 5 would be enough to make a start. 8 felt like something approaching a foundation. On the morning of the 3rd day, I received a message from Soreth Vaughn. It was not the response I expected. I had anticipated either a formal rejection or a request for more time, dressed up in language that would make the request for time sound like a considered diplomatic position. What I received instead was a single clause, transmitted in plain council standard without preamble. The executive committee is prepared to discuss the terms of reassociation. Reassociation. Not readmission. Not reinstatement. Reassociation. A different word. And the word was a choice. Readmission implied that Earth had left and was being allowed back in on the council's terms. Reassociation implied 2 parties reaching an agreement. The word acknowledged, in the precise and careful language of galactic diplomacy, that the terms were going to be Earth's terms, or something close to them. I sent back, "I will be in the main conference chamber at 900 hours. Then I called Owen and Vera and told them to be ready at 8:30. Then I sent a message to my daughter that said, "Going to have a big day. I am fine. Yes to xenobiology. Call me this weekend." She replied 17 minutes later, which meant she was supposed to be in school and was clearly not paying full attention to her lessons. "What's happening? You're on the news. Are you famous now?" I typed, "A little bit. Back to class." I did not smile, because I was already in preparation mode, and preparation mode does not leave much room for smiling. But the message sat warm somewhere in the background of my mind for the rest of the morning, which I think was the point. My daughter had always been very good at the point. The news had reached Earth 41 hours after I walked out of the chamber. I know this because Vera tracked the media cycle carefully. She had a background in communications before she moved into economics, and she understood how the speed of information shaped the pressure that came with it. The initial reports were incomplete, which was expected. The full session recordings were council property and would not be released for 6 weeks under standard protocol. What had leaked? And in a station housing 114 diplomatic missions, something always leaks, was the broad shape of events: Earth's withdrawal, the walkout, the corridor gathering, the private meeting with Soreth Vaughn. The details were wrong in several places. The emotional tone of most reports was not wrong at all. Earth, the reports said, had stood up. I was aware of this because Earth's Secretary General, a woman named Clara Adeyemi, who had been doing the hardest job in human government for 7 years, and who communicated with me in the precise and economical language of someone who trusts completely that the recipient will understand what is not said, had sent me a single sentence at the 42-hour mark. The reaction at home is what you would expect. I understood what she meant. I had been doing this long enough to know what you would expect meant in the context of something this significant happening on a station far from home. It meant relief and pride, and the particular kind of restless energy that comes over people when something they have been quietly hoping for without letting themselves fully articulate it suddenly happens. It meant long queues at the council's public information channels, and people in cafes and offices watching whatever fragmentary footage was available, and a great deal of noise in the public conversation that was not entirely coherent, but was entirely genuine. It also meant pressure. The kind of pressure that builds when a population has decided, collectively and quickly, that a thing is good, and then turns its attention to making sure the thing continues to be good. Secretary General Adeyemi had 7 legislative bodies, 4 oversight committees, and approximately 8 billion people, all of whom now had an opinion about what I should do next. She was managing that pressure from Earth while I was managing the situation on the station, and the fact that she was sending me precisely 1 sentence every 12 hours, rather than a constant stream of directives, was itself a form of trust that I did not take lightly. The 900 hours meeting was in the main conference chamber. Not the accord where the formal session had been, but the adjacent diplomatic conference space, which was smaller and designed for working meetings rather than formal proceedings. Round table, 6 seats on each side, no tiers, no center podium. Everyone at the same height. That had been my request, and the council had agreed to it, which was another small signal. Soreth Vaughn was there with 4 advisors, the same 2 from the private meeting plus 2 new ones, whom I recognized as specialists in compact constitutional law. That told me something about how they were planning to approach the conversation. They were looking at the structural implications of the terms, not just the political ones. Constitutional lawyers meant they were thinking about how to fit Earth's terms into the existing framework of the compact, rather than simply accepting or rejecting them at face value. That was useful information. It told me they had already decided the answer was not a flat rejection. Owen, Vera, and I sat across from them. Lyra was also present, at my invitation, in an observer capacity that the council had accepted without objection, which itself told me that Lyra's presence here was not a surprise to them, and had possibly been discussed in whatever internal conversations the council had been having for the past 72 hours. The Valari's position was shifting. The council knew it. No one was pretending otherwise. Soreth Vaughn opened the meeting without ceremony. The executive committee has reviewed the document. And, I said, and we have objections to 3 clauses and questions about the implementation of 4 others. The broad framework, we are prepared to accept as the basis for negotiation. Negotiation, not rejection, not concession. Negotiation, a word that assumed mutual engagement toward a shared goal, even when the parties came to the table from very different starting positions. Which 3 clauses? I said. He named them. I had expected 2 of the 3. The third surprised me slightly. It was a clause about joint oversight of navigational infrastructure, which I had included specifically because I believed it was reasonable and expected it to be received as a good faith offer. The council's objection to it was based not on the principle, but on the implementation timeline, which they felt was too short for the administrative adjustment it required. That was a substantive objection, not a political one. It told me the constitutional lawyers had done their work carefully. We can discuss the timeline, I said. Over the next 4 hours, we discussed the timeline. We discussed the exact language of the veto mechanism in Earth's requested co-governing clause. We discussed the definition of human-inhabited space for purposes of the fleet autonomy provision, a definition that mattered considerably because the boundary of what counted as human space had been shifting steadily outward for 3 decades, and neither side wanted to sign something that became obsolete the following year. We discussed the communication protocols for the Joint Oversight Body, which was a technical conversation that Vera handled primarily, and which I mostly listened to while watching Soreth Vaughn watch me. He was trying to read me the same way I was trying to read him. 11 years of sessions together, and we were still doing this. The careful mutual calibration of 2 people who had always known that this conversation was somewhere in the future, and had spent a great deal of time preparing for it in different ways. I thought, watching him, that he was probably the best counterpart I could have had for this particular negotiation. Not because he was easy, he was not easy. Because he was honest, in the way that skilled diplomats are honest. Not about their position, which they guard, but about the shape of the situation, which they cannot afford to misread. He knew the shape of the situation. He had known it since Vera's presentation in the private meeting, if not before. The question that the 72 hours had resolved was not whether the Council could accept Earth's terms, but whether the alternative was worse. It was worse. They had run the numbers. The passage rights question was the most delicate part of the afternoon. Earth's fleet was positioned at 3 of the 4 most significant hyperspace corridors in the settled galaxy. This was not an accident. It was 60 years of patient strategic positioning, the kind of long-term thinking that had been possible, because the people doing the thinking were not trying to survive a crisis. They were preparing for one. The Council had known about this positioning, Soreth Vaughn confirmed, for approximately 12 years. They had categorized it as concerning in internal documents, but had not moved to address it because addressing it would have required acknowledging that they had been systematically underestimating Earth, which was a conversation the Inner Ring's majority had not wanted to have. Now they were having it, 12 years late, with all parties at the same table height. The corridor positioning, Soreth Vaughn said, at approximately the 2-hour mark of the afternoon session, gives Earth an effective blocking capability over 63% of Inner Ring trade routes. 48%, Vera said, without looking up from her datapad. The Charathi constitutional advisor, who had been very quiet for most of the session, said, "Our figures indicate 63. Your figures use the pre-2371 corridor map," Vera said. 3 of the Inner Ring's major trade routes were rerouted after the Geneth incident. We updated our maps. The effective blocking capability on the current routes is 48.2%, which I will accept being rounded to 48. There was a brief silence while the Council's advisors checked something on their devices. Then, 48.2, the constitutional advisor confirmed. "Yes," said Vera. "That is still," Soreth Vaughn said carefully, "a significant percentage." "It is," I agreed. "And the terms in the document ensure that Earth does not use that positioning as a unilateral instrument, which is, I believe, the concern you have." He looked at me. "It is one of the concerns. The terms address it honestly. I am not going to stand here and tell you that Earth's positioning is not strategically significant. It is. You know it is. What I can tell you is that the document creates a framework in which that significance is managed cooperatively rather than unilaterally, and in which Earth has formal obligations regarding the corridors that are legally binding rather than dependent on goodwill. Legally binding to what enforcement mechanism? To the Joint Oversight Body, and to the secondary accord signatories, who represent an independent verification layer." Soreth Vaughn looked at me for a moment. "You are building a check on yourselves. We are building a check on everyone, including ourselves. That is what a functional framework does." He looked at his advisors. The constitutional lawyer on his left. I did not know his name, I realized. I had been dealing with him for 4 hours, and had not asked. Said something in Valari too low for me to catch. Soreth Vaughn nodded slowly. "We need an additional 48 hours, he said. I had expected 72. 48 is acceptable, I said. He stood. His advisors stood. He did not extend his primary limbs this time. The formal equal acknowledgement gesture of the day before was not repeated, which could have meant many things but which I read as, We are still in process, and the formal acknowledgement will come when the process is complete. That was a professional reading, not a negative one. They left. Owen closed the door. Lyra, who had sat for 4 hours without speaking, said, "He is going to sign." "I believe so," I said. "The constitutional lawyers were looking for implementation paths, not exit clauses," she said. "That is what you look for when the answer is yes, and you are managing the how." "Yes," I said. "That is what I observed." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "What happens to the secondary accord if the council accepts the terms?" It was the right question. It was the question I had been sitting with since the first provisional signatures went on the document. The accord exists regardless. Its members remain its members. It becomes a complementary structure rather than an alternative one. A body within the broader framework that maintains independent standing and independent voice. That changes the compact's internal dynamics significantly. "Yes," I said. "It does." She considered that. "You planned this as well." "I planned for the possibility of it," I said. The accord was designed to be functional, either inside or outside the compact's framework. I did not know which case would obtain until this week. She made the warm sound again, the deliberate expression of something that was not quite amusement, but was related to it. 11 years, she said. "You sat in a folding chair for 11 years. I sat in a folding chair," I said, "and I watched, and I took notes, and I filed documents, and I updated my plans every 6 months, and I ate protein blocks that tasted of nothing, and I called my daughter every week, and I attended every session regardless of whether I thought anything useful would happen in it, because I was not going to be the person who missed the moment because she had decided in advance it was not worth attending." Lyra looked at me for a long moment, both sets of eyelids, in the slow sequence that meant something I read as deep consideration. Then she said, "I want to learn that. What you do. How you hold that much patience, and that much preparation, at the same time. It helps," I said, "to be very sure about why." She thought about that. I let her think. In 48 hours, the council would give us their answer. In the meantime, there was more work to do. There was always more work to do. And I had learned long ago that the best thing you can do in the space between one significant event and the next is to be as useful as possible in every hour between them. I opened my datapad to the next item on my list. The next 48 hours were not quiet. They were busy in a specific way, not with crisis, but with the work that a shifting structure creates when the people working within it are professional enough to begin adjusting before the shift is formally confirmed. 3 more species sent requests for information about the secondary accord. I had Owen handle the initial responses, factual, welcoming, non-committal on timing, because you do not want species joining a new framework because they are panicking about the old one. You want them joining because they have genuinely assessed their interests and decided this is where those interests are best served. Panic-driven decisions tend to produce members who become obstacles when the immediate crisis passes and they start second-guessing. The Thressi delegation, the ones who had expressed agreement through color change during the first accord meeting, sent their formal provisional signature through the night. That made 9. I had not told anyone about the Thressi communication because I was not yet certain what their political situation at home looked like, and species whose home governments were unstable brought unpredictability to frameworks that needed to be dependable. By morning it was clear their home government had been consulted and was fully aligned. I confirmed their signature with a brief, warm message that I drafted carefully to be welcoming without being effusive. The Thressi communication style responded badly to effusiveness. Vera had found, during a detailed review of the compact's infrastructure records, 3 relay stations that appeared in the Council's official maintenance budget, but which were physically located within the operational territory of secondary Accord member species, not Earth, the 3 other Accord members. I flagged this for Owen, who flagged it to the relevant delegations. 2 of them responded immediately. Their reaction was, in all 3 species' different ways, essentially identical. They had not known these stations were in the compact's maintenance budget. They had been maintaining the stations themselves for years. They would like that corrected. It was a small thing, infrastructure accounting, but it was also, in the careful language of what such discoveries reveal, evidence of a pattern. The compact had been collecting credit, in terms of member loyalty, in terms of the unspoken debt that comes from being perceived as the provider of essential services, for infrastructure that its members were actually maintaining themselves. It was not deliberate fraud, probably. It was the kind of thing that happens when a system is old enough and large enough that no one has audited the original agreements against the current reality for several generations. I added it to my notes. If the new framework was going to work, it was going to need an honest accounting of what everyone was actually contributing and what everyone was actually receiving. That audit was going to be a long and uncomfortable process for everyone involved, including Earth. I was prepared for that. Discomfort was not the enemy. Pretending the discomfort did not exist was the enemy. On the morning of the second day, I received a message from a source I had not heard from in 3 years, a human analyst named Peter Grieve, who worked in Earth's Deep Intelligence Division and whom I had met exactly twice in person and corresponded with perhaps 40 times via carefully encrypted channels. He wrote in the compressed professional shorthand we had developed over those 40 correspondences. Inner Ring Economic Council met privately yesterday. Duration, 6 hours. Our sources say the word used most often was irreversible, not a complaint, a description. They know where they are. I wrote back 3 words, as planned. Thanks. He responded, you're welcome. Sleep sometime. Everyone kept telling me to sleep. I was beginning to suspect this was their way of saying, you have done enough for now. Let it land. I understood the sentiment, even if I could not entirely follow the advice. Sleep was for the gaps between necessary things, and there were not many gaps right now. The morning of the 48th hour was calm in the way that follows a long, complex process, when all the significant work has already been done, and the remaining event is primarily formal. The council's answer arrived not as a message but as a physical visit. Soreth Vaughn himself, unannounced, at the conference room where I had been working since 6 in the morning. He had brought no advisors. He came alone. That was unusual enough that I stood up when he entered, which I did not always do. I had learned early that the choreography of courtesy in diplomatic settings communicated as much as the words. Standing when someone entered was an acknowledgement of significance. I stood because the moment was significant, and because he had come alone, and because coming alone, without the protection of advisors and the structure of formal process, was its own form of vulnerability that deserved acknowledgement. He sat across from me. The table between us was smaller than the conference table. This was my working desk, not a meeting surface. We were closer than we had been in any formal session. That was probably intentional on his part. He said, the executive committee has voted, 81 to 33, with no abstentions. I did not respond immediately. The numbers told the story. This was not a narrow agreement. This was not the minimum majority necessary for political cover. 81 out of 114 was a substantial vote. The kind of vote that happens when the people voting have decided they are not doing this because they must, but because on reflection they have concluded it is the correct direction, or because the mathematics of the situation was simply too clear to argue with. Both things could be true. The terms are accepted, he said, with 2 modifications to implementation language that our constitutional lawyers drafted, and which I have sent to Owen for your review. If the modifications are consistent with the intent of the clauses, I said, we will accept them. They are. I would not bring them otherwise. I believed him. He was not a person who operated through trick or misdirection. He was a person who operated through structure, and the structure he was proposing to maintain was just different from the one he had been defending 3 days ago. He looked at me for a moment. His bioluminescence was in the pattern I now associated with him when he was speaking as himself, rather than as an institutional representative. I want to say something outside the formal record. Of course, I said. We should have been better. The council should have been better. I know that is not sufficient. I know also that it changes nothing that has already occurred. But I want it to be said, because I believe it is true, and because the record that comes out of this week will shape how the next 100 years of interactions proceed. And I would like the record to include that this side of the table understands what happened here. I sat with that for a moment. It was not an apology exactly. Apologies are personal. This was something more institutional, an acknowledgement that carries the weight of an organization rather than a single individual. In the specific context of galactic diplomacy, it was the hardest kind of statement to make, because it cost more than a personal admission, and the personal cost could always be deflected or minimized. What he was doing could not be deflected. "I hear it," I said, "and I believe it is genuine, and I also believe that what matters now is what we build from here." He nodded. "We agree on that." He stood. He extended his primary limbs. I extended mine. The gesture was the same as 2 days ago. Equal acknowledgement. But the quality of it was different now. Then it had been provisional. The gesture of beings who were moving toward something. Now it was settled. The gesture of beings who had arrived. He left. I stood in the conference room for a moment, after the door closed, and I thought about 61 years of patient building, and 40,000 people on a ship called the Meridian Dawn, and the folding chair in the fourth ring, and my daughter who wanted to be a xenobiologist, and Clara Adeyemi managing 8 billion people's reactions to this week from an office on another planet. I thought about all of it, briefly and fully, and then I opened my datapad and began the message to Earth that began. Terms accepted. Full framework. Here is what comes next. There was a great deal that came next. There always is. The signing ceremony was not what I had imagined. I had not spent much time imagining it, in the way that you do not let yourself imagine the end of a very long project, because imagining the end can make you less careful about the middle. But I had a vague expectation of something formal and architecturally significant. The great chamber of accord, full assembly, all the lights and official language of a moment that the history books would record. That was what the Compact's tradition called for. That was how things like this had been done for 4 centuries. What happened instead was that the 2 signing events, the Compact Reassociation Agreement and the formal establishment of the Secondary Accord as a recognized body within the galactic framework, were held in the same medium-sized conference room I had been working in all week, at a table with seats for 22, over the course of 2.5 hours, with no ceremonial music, no formal dress beyond what everyone was already wearing, and a platter of food from the station's general catering that someone had apparently ordered without being asked, and which included both human-appropriate and Valari-appropriate items, side by side. I chose this. Soreth Vaughn had offered the chamber. I declined. The chamber was the architecture of the old relationship. High seats and low seats, tiers and rings, the center podium that made every speaker look up at the room looking down. I did not want to sign anything in that room. I wanted to sign it here, where the table was flat, and the seats were all at the same height, and there were no historical weight in the walls. Soreth Vaughn had not objected. He had, in fact, agreed with a speed that told me he had perhaps been thinking the same thing. The signatories arrived over the course of 30 minutes. Earth first, Owen and Vera and me, plus 3 members of Earth's Military Oversight Committee, who had traveled from the nearest Earth installation specifically for this moment. They arrived looking, all 3 of them, slightly overwhelmed and slightly exhausted in the specific way of people who have been awake for too long and feeling too many things at once, and are keeping it together because the moment requires it. The Council's Executive Committee arrived next. Soreth Vaughn and 6 representatives, all carrying their own personal signing devices rather than using the Council's official instruments. I noticed that. Using personal devices rather than official ones was, in this context, a gesture of individual commitment in addition to institutional commitment. Someone had thought about that detail, and I appreciated it. The Secondary Accord signatories arrived last, some together and some individually. Lyra came with 2 other Valari officials who had traveled from their nearest embassy station overnight. The Charathi elder arrived with 3 of his younger colleagues. The Praxis delegates arrived together, moving in the synchronized way of their species that always looked choreographed, but apparently was not. The Thressi came in too, and stood very close together, which was their comfort posture in unfamiliar social settings. 2 additional species who had finalized their provisional signatures overnight arrived last and slightly breathless, as if they had moved faster than they had expected to get there. We had 11 Secondary Accord members when the door closed. I had not planned on 11. I had planned on 5 being enough. 11 was, by the standard of any new framework attempting to establish itself against an existing dominant structure, an extraordinary start. I stood at the head of the table and looked at the room. Beings of 11 species, plus Earth, plus the Council's representatives. An assortment of physiologies and technologies and communication systems and centuries of history, some of it shared, some of it not, all of it present in this room, at this moment. I said, "We have 2 documents to sign. Both are available in full to every person in this room, in Council Standard and in the primary language of each member species. I will not be giving a speech. We will sign the Compact Reassociation Agreement first, then the Secondary Accords founding document, and then we will stop holding this table captive and let the station's catering staff take it back. Are there any questions before we proceed? There were no questions. I had learned, over 11 years, that giving people the option to ask questions at the moment of action, rather than during the deliberation period, almost never produces questions. What it produces is a moment of shared acknowledgement that the deliberation is done and the action is beginning. The pause itself is the function. We signed the Compact Reassociation Agreement. It took 40 minutes, because 22 signatories using different signing instruments that needed to be registered in 3 different authentication systems is a logistical process, regardless of the historical significance of the document. I signed for Earth. Soreth Vaughn signed for the Council. Both signatures were registered simultaneously, a detail I had insisted on because sequential signing implied an order of precedence I did not want established. Then we signed the Secondary Accord founding document. This one was faster because the Accord's authentication system was simpler. I had designed it to be simpler, on the grounds that accessibility matters, and complexity in administrative systems tends to favor those who have the most experience with the existing complexity. Earth signed first as founding member, then Valari, then Charathi, then Praxis Collective, then the others, in alphabetical order by species name and Council Standard, because alphabetical order is the most neutral sequence available, and neutral sequences matter when you are establishing a body where all members are supposed to be equal. When the last signature was registered, the room did not applaud. Most of the species present did not have a cultural reflex equivalent to applause. What happened was a series of different acknowledgement gestures that together produced a kind of collective sound, some vocal, some gestural, one entirely non-visual, that the room held for perhaps 15 seconds before it began to dissolve back into the movement of people. I picked up the food from the catering platter. I had not eaten properly for 2 days. The protein blocks were there, the ones that tasted of nothing in particular. There was also something I did not recognize that smelled quite good. I ate the protein block first, because it was reliable, and then took a small amount of the other thing, which turned out to be a preparation that 2 of the Accord member species both used, and which tasted, strangely, of something like warm bread. Soreth Vaughn came and stood beside me. He also took something from the platter. We stood there eating for a moment without speaking, which was comfortable in the way that silences become comfortable, when the work has been done, and the silence is no longer a strategic tool, but just a silence between 2 people. He said, "What happens next?" For the Council, the structural adjustments begin. Joint oversight of the corridor infrastructure. The veto mechanism goes into effect when the registration period completes, which I believe your constitutional team set at 90 days. And for the Accord? For the Accord, we meet in 6 weeks for the first formal session. Agenda items include the infrastructure audit, the trade recalibration protocols, and a discussion of expansion criteria for new members. He was quiet for a moment. You are expecting more. I am expecting, I said carefully, that other species will assess their situation in the light of what this week has established and make their own decisions. I am not recruiting. That distinction matters to you. That distinction is the difference between a framework that grows because it serves its members, and a framework that grows because people are afraid not to join it. The first kind lasts. The second kind produces the problems that we have spent this week attempting to solve. He looked at me with the expression I had learned to read as, "I hear you, and I believe you, and I wish we had been having this conversation 20 years ago. I have been in this role for 19 years, he said. I have presided over more than 300 formal sessions. I have mediated disputes between species whose mutual hostility predates any living memory. I have, in that time, become quite good at recognizing when an outcome was inevitable and when it was contingent on the actions of specific beings." I waited. "This outcome," he said, "was contingent. Another ambassador, in the same circumstances, might have found a different path, or no path at all. Another ambassador might have done better," I said. "Possibly," he said, "but they would have had to be different from you in specific ways, and those specific ways are not, in my experience, common." I thought about how to respond to that. I thought about the people who had prepared me for this role, my training officers, my predecessors in the position, the people in Earth's diplomatic service who had built the protocols and frameworks and communication systems that I had used, the engineers and planners who had built the fleet, the analysts who had maintained the intelligence. A great many people had made this week possible. I had been the one standing at the podium, but the standing was the last step of a long walk. I was the right person at the right time, I said. That is mostly a matter of timing. He made a sound that his translator did not render. I think because it was below the frequency threshold of the translation algorithm. But I understood it as something like, "You are being modest in a way I do not entirely believe, but I respect the modesty." We stood together for another moment. Then Owen appeared at my elbow with the quiet urgency of a person who has been managing something for 15 minutes and has reached the limit of managing it without me. "Earth's media coordinator," he said quietly. "They would like to know if you are available for a statement in the next hour, before the news cycle closes in the Asian time zones." I looked at him. "Tell them I will send a written statement. 3 paragraphs. Plain language. No diplomatic phrasing. They will ask for video. Tell them the written statement is what is available, and that it will say everything the video would have said, and several things the video format would not have allowed me to say clearly." He went to handle it. Soreth Vaughn watched him go, then looked back at me. "Video statement," he said. "I am not photogenic after 2 nights of very little sleep," I said. He made the sound again, the one below the translation threshold. I finished my food. The room was still full of people, conversations happening in multiple languages, some through translators and some not, beings who had just signed 2 documents that would shape the next century of galactic interaction standing around a catering table eating things that had been selected by a station catering service that had not been told why the order was so large or why it needed to include something from 11 different species' dietary requirements. I thought about my written statement. I knew what I wanted to say. 3 paragraphs, plain language. The first paragraph about what had been signed and what it meant in simple terms. The second paragraph about why, in the plainest way I could make it plain without being either triumphalist or falsely modest. The third paragraph about what came next, because outcomes without a clear next step are just events, and events that are just events fade. I thought about how to write the second paragraph. Why? That was the question that the next 100 news cycles and the next 100 historians were going to ask. And the answer mattered, because if it was framed incorrectly, it would become the wrong story, and the wrong story tends to produce the wrong lessons. The answer was not because we were strong enough. Strength was part of it, but strength alone does not explain why patience and 60 years of quiet work and a folding chair in the 4th ring were the instruments. The answer was because we understood that some outcomes can only be reached by the long route, and we were willing to take it. I started drafting the paragraph in my head. Owen would need it in 40 minutes. That was enough time, if I started now. The written statement went out at the 1-hour mark and generated, according to Owen's tracking, over 40 million individual reads in the first 6 hours. The response was what Clara Adeyemi had described as, what you would expect. But in this case, what you would expect meant something I had not fully braced for. The messages. Not official messages, those were handled through channels and responded to by Owen and Vera, and the 3 military oversight officials who were still at the station, and who had nothing to do now that the signing was complete, except assist with the administrative follow-up. Personal messages. Sent to the Earth Embassy's public contact address, which existed nominally so that individuals could submit concerns and inquiries that would be reviewed quarterly by a junior staff member. In the 36 hours following the signing, that address received messages from 942,000 people. Owen showed me the digest. He had sorted them by category, a kind response from a junior staff member who had clearly never expected to be doing triage on near 1 million personal messages. The largest category, at 68%, was simply, "Thank you." No explanation, no additional detail. Just the 2 words, some in English, some in the 37 other major Earth languages. A few in languages I did not recognize and which might have been alien in origin, from species whose members had Earth-facing communication capabilities, and had evidently decided to use them. The second largest category, at 22%, was messages from people who had lost someone on the Meridian Dawn. I had not expected that. I should have, but I had not. The incident was 61 years ago. The youngest survivors would be in their 70s. But families carry these things. I knew that abstractly, seeing 900 addresses of descendants of people who died on that ship, all of them writing some version of, "I watched your statement and I cried, for the first time since I was 20 years old, and I just wanted you to know that." That was not abstract. I read 40 of them. I could not read all of them and continue to function, so I read 40, and gave myself permission to stop, because some situations require you to make a careful accounting of what you can hold without spilling it. I asked Owen to send a personal acknowledgement, brief, not a form letter, to every address in that category. He spent the next 2 days doing exactly that. The third category was proposals, suggestions, ideas, requests, and in several cases fully drafted plans for what should happen next, some from scholars, and some from people who clearly had no background in diplomacy, but had opinions that were entirely sincere, and occasionally remarkably useful. I read these more selectively, flagged 8 of them for Vera to review, and added 3 specific points to my working notes for the Accord's first formal session. The public response was one part of a larger pattern I was watching. The other parts were less visible but more structurally significant. 3 inner ring council species had quietly issued statements welcoming the new association framework, statements calibrated to be supportive, without suggesting they were reconsidering their own alignment with the compact's majority. That was the language of beings who were moving carefully in a new political landscape and had not yet decided how far to move, but had decided that being openly hostile to the framework was not in their interest. 2 more outer ring species had sent formal inquiries to the Accord's newly established communication channel, the one Owen had set up the previous night, a simple address with a routing system that he had apparently built from scratch in 4 hours. They were not applying, they were asking questions. That was the right way to approach it, and I sent Owen a message that said, "Reply warmly, answer their questions fully, make no promises about timelines, and do not suggest urgency." The compact, meanwhile, was adjusting. The structural changes required by the reassociation terms were not fast. Institutional change rarely is, but the first signs were already visible. The Joint Oversight Body's initial meeting had been scheduled. The veto mechanism's registration period had begun. 3 administrative procedures that had previously governed Earth's participation in compact sessions had been formally retired and replaced with new ones that reflected the equal standing language of the new framework. Small things, procedural things, the kind of things that make no news and do not appear in history books but which are the actual substance of how power structures change, not in the moments of visible drama, but in the 100 small administrative adjustments that follow, each one shifting the baseline slightly from what it was before. I found this part of the work satisfying in a way that was harder to explain than the satisfaction of the chamber sessions or the negotiations. It was the satisfaction of concrete change, of things that were one way becoming another way, and staying that way because the paperwork reflected it. Paperwork was not glamorous. Paperwork was durable. On the 4th day after the signing, I received a message from Clara Adeyemi that was longer than her usual communications. 4 full paragraphs, which was for her the equivalent of a very long letter. She wrote about the response at home, the genuine, wide response that had moved through Earth's population in ways that were not entirely predictable and that she was still processing. She wrote about the legislative bodies and how they were adjusting to the new reality of Earth's position. She wrote about the people who disagreed, not many, but present, and making their disagreement known in the usual ways that disagreement gets made known, and how she was managing that without letting it become the story. And then she wrote, in the final paragraph, something I kept returning to. "I want you to know that when we chose you for this position, 11 years ago, we were choosing for a kind of patience that most people do not possess. We were asking you to go somewhere difficult and sit quietly and wait for a moment that might not come for years, and to be ready when it did, and to not lose faith in the meantime. That is an unreasonable thing to ask of a person. You did it anyway. I did not say that enough while it was happening, because saying it would have felt like counting something before it was finished. I am saying it now because it is finished, and because you deserve to hear it." I read that paragraph 4 times. Then I filed it where I kept things I wanted to remember, and I sent her back 2 words. "Thank you, Clara." She sent, "Sleep." I did. Finally. 6 full hours. The recyclers made their sound. The corridor outside was quiet. Somewhere in the distance, the station went on existing, and 40,000 Earth ships went on being positioned where they were, and 11 species continued figuring out what it meant to be members of something new. I slept and did not dream, and when I woke up there was more work waiting, which was exactly right. 6 weeks after the signing, I sat in a proper seat. This is a small thing and not a small thing. In the first formal session of the secondary accord, the chairs around the table were all the same height, the same material, the same distance from the table's edge. I had specified this when Owen was arranging the logistics, and he had confirmed it without comment, because he understood the reason, without needing me to explain it. When you build something new, the details of how people sit in a room together are not decorative. They are the physical expression of what you have decided to believe about how the people in the room relate to each other. The table was in the Accord's newly designated meeting space, a set of rooms in a section of the station that had previously been administrative storage, which the station's operations manager had released to us with what I interpreted as genuine goodwill rather than reluctant compliance. She had personally supervised the conversion, and the rooms had arrived furnished with chairs that were specifically height adjustable, which was thoughtful in a way that I noted and planned to acknowledge properly when I had a free moment. I had not had many free moments. The 6 weeks between the signing and the first session had been the busiest of my career, which was a sentence I would not previously have thought possible given the 11 years before them. The Accord's administrative structure had to be built from scratch, not the political framework, that was in the founding document, but the day-to-day operational reality of a body that needed communication channels, authentication systems, a neutral archive, dispute resolution protocols, financial accountability mechanisms, and a dozen other things that the document referenced in principle, without specifying in detail, because you cannot specify details in a founding document without making it 60 pages long and impossible to sign in good faith, because no one can meaningfully agree to 60 pages of specific operational detail before the organization exists to generate the experience that would make those details sensible. Owen had hired 4 people in the first week. Vera had brought in 2 specialists from Earth's Economic Policy Division. The Charathi Elder had contributed 2 of his experienced administrative staff, beings who had spent decades inside the Compact's bureaucracy and who knew where every procedural trap was buried, which was valuable beyond any description I could give it. Lyra had sent 3 Valari analysts who specialized in interspecies communication protocols, which addressed one of the problems I had been quietly worried about. The Accord currently had 11 member species with 11 different primary communication modes, and if we could not build reliable communication infrastructure across that range, none of the substantive work would be possible. The communication problem was harder than the political one, in several respects. The political work required clarity of intent and willingness to compromise. The communication work required finding the specific technical and social bridges between ways of processing and sharing information that had evolved independently across thousands of years and multiple star systems. There was existing compact infrastructure for some of this, the translation bead network, the standard language framework, but those had been built by and for species who were already compact members, and their gaps were precisely in the areas where the Accord's membership lived. We solved 3 of the most urgent gaps in the first week. The other 5 we were still working on when the first formal session convened. I opened the session by acknowledging this directly, because one of the things I had decided this body would be different about was the practice of performing operational competence at the expense of honest accounting. The Compact performed competence constantly. It had beautiful formal sessions and flawlessly executed ceremonial procedures, and an archive system that was a genuine marvel of organizational achievement, and those things coexisted with processes that consistently failed the species who most needed them to work. I was not willing to build the same architecture with a different coat. "We are not finished building this," I said to the room at the session's opening. "We will not be finished building it by the time we conclude this session, or the next one, or the one after that. A framework of this kind is a continuous construction. What I am asking of everyone in this room is not that we pretend otherwise, but that we build with the understanding that pretending otherwise produces the problems we are here because we wanted to solve." The room received this without visible distress, which told me I had chosen my founding members well. The species who needed everything to look finished before they could engage with it had not been among those who signed. The first session's agenda covered 4 major items: the infrastructure audit results, the trade recalibration proposals, the expansion criteria for new members, and a review of the communication systems work in progress. We got through 2.5 of them in the scheduled time, which I considered a success. 2.5 substantive items in a first session of a new interspecies body was, by any historical comparison I could draw on, significantly better than average. The infrastructure audit was the most revealing item. What Vera and the Charathi administrative staff had found over 6 weeks of careful work was not surprising to me, because I had expected to find something like it. It was, however, more extensive than I had hoped. Across the 11 Accord member species, there were 47 instances of infrastructure that had been listed in the Compact's records as Compact maintained, but which was in reality maintained by the member species themselves, often for decades, and in some cases for longer. There were 12 instances of navigation data that member species had been collecting and sharing with each other through unofficial channels because the official Compact channels were too slow or too expensive to be practical. There were 3 cases where the Compact's official trade accounting significantly differed from the actual trade flows, because the official figures were based on declarations made by inner ring intermediaries, who took a portion of the value and reported the remainder. None of this was unique to the Accord members. The Charathi staff believed that similar patterns existed throughout the Compact's membership structure. What was unique was that we were the ones doing the audit. The audit report was a document I was proud of, not because its findings were positive, but because its methodology was honest and its conclusions were specific. It named names in the sense that it identified specific infrastructure items and specific trade routes and specific accounting discrepancies. It did not editorialize. It did not conclude that anyone had acted in bad faith. It presented facts and let the facts be facts. We voted to share the full audit with the Compact's executive committee. The vote was 11-0. The decision was not difficult. We had signed a reassociation agreement that required transparency in both directions, and transparency in both directions meant that information which affected the Compact's operational reality needed to be in the Compact's hands. That was what equal standing partners did. Sorath Vaughn sent an acknowledgement of the audit report 3 hours after we transmitted it. 1 sentence: "We appreciate the thoroughness of this work." I read it twice, because in his communication style, 1 sentence meant a great deal, and thoroughness, in this context, meant something closer to honesty than to quality of methodology. After the session concluded and the room was clearing, the Valari analyst who had spent 6 weeks solving communication protocol problems, a young specialist named Aaron, who had the Valari quality of seeming much older than she was, approached me and asked if she could speak informally. "Of course," I said. She said, "I want to understand something. When you built the secondary Accord document, before any of this week happened, when you were writing it without knowing who would sign it or whether anyone would, how did you know it would be functional? How did you know the structure you were designing would work for species you had not consulted?" I thought about this. It was a good question, and it deserved a real answer. "I did not know," I said. "I believed it would be, based on what I understood about the species I thought might be interested. But belief is not certainty. The structure I designed was based on the observation that most of the problems the Compact's junior members had experienced were problems of process, specifically, processes designed by and for beings whose experience of the galaxy predated everyone else's, and who had, naturally, and without much examination, built their processes around their own assumptions. I thought if I stripped out the assumptions and built processes that started from first principles, the framework would be adaptable enough to work for species I had not predicted. That turned out to be correct, so far. But so far is doing significant work in that sentence. She thought about that. You built for adaptability rather than specificity. I built for honesty and adaptability. Yes. Specific is easier in the short term and harder in the long term. If you design a process around the specific needs of 5 species, you have a process that works well for 5 species and breaks when the 6th arrives. If you design it around first principles that the 5 species can all recognize as fair, the 6th species has a better chance of recognizing them too. She nodded slowly. We were taught, in our training, that the compact structure was the best available model for interspecies governance, because it had survived 400 years. It did survive 400 years, I said. That is true, and worth acknowledging. An institution that lasts 400 years has something right about it. What it has right may also be why it has something wrong about it. The same features that make an institution durable can make it resistant to the adaptations it needs to remain just. Longevity is not the same as correctness. She looked at me with the careful attention that I had come to recognize as the Valari mode of recording something for later, rather than responding to it immediately. Then she said, "I am glad I was sent here." "So am I said, and I meant it. The room emptied. Owen appeared with the inevitable list of things that needed attention before the day ended. I went through them efficiently. 2 communications drafted, 1 decision deferred to the next session, 1 question answered with more detail than Owen had thought necessary but which I thought was warranted. When that was done, I walked to the viewport in the corridor outside the Accord's meeting space. It looked out at open space. Not a particularly dramatic view. Nothing that would appear in a travel catalog. Stars and dark. The permanent and uncrowded neighborhood of the universe beyond the station's hull. I thought about what Aaron had asked me. How did you know the structure would work? The honest answer, which I had not given her because it was not quite the right register for a professional conversation about governance design, was, I did not build the structure from certainty. I built it from the kind of conviction that is not certain but is committed. The difference matters. Certainty does not require courage because it already knows the outcome. Conviction requires it, because conviction moves toward an outcome it believes in, while remaining genuinely aware that belief and reality can diverge. 11 years in a folding chair, 6 decades of accumulated patience by people I had never met, but whose work had made mine possible. 40,000 names that I had read in the Council's own archive, in their own clinical language of regrettable outcome, on a document that I had read so many times I could recite it in my sleep and sometimes did. All of that to arrive at a proper seat, at a table where the chairs were the same height, at a first session of a body that did not yet know what it would become but knew what it was committed to being. That was enough for today. The rest was the work of the next years, and the years after those, and the generations of people who would come after all of us and continue building. I had no illusions that what we had done this week was complete. Nothing of this kind is ever complete. It is only ongoing, or it is abandoned. We had chosen ongoing. My datapad chimed. A message from my daughter. "Hi, Mum. I watched the first session footage. You didn't smile once. Are you happy?" I typed back, "Yes. I am not a very visible smiler." She sent, "I know. Dad says that's a diplomatic skill. I think it's just how you are." I thought about that. Then I typed, "Probably both." She sent, "When are you coming home?" I looked at the stars outside the viewport. I looked at the station around me, at the work still on my datapad, at the 11-member species still figuring out what it meant to be part of something we were building together in real time. "Soon," I typed. "There is still work to do here, but soon." She sent back a single word, "Okay." That was enough. I put my datapad away. The corridor was quiet. The recyclers made their sound. Somewhere in the meeting room behind me, the chairs were still arranged the way I had asked for them, all the same height, all the same distance from the table. And tomorrow, they would be there again, for the second half of the agenda we had not reached today. I filed my report for the day. At the top, under the outcome field that every diplomatic report included, I wrote 2 words. They were the 2 words I had promised myself I would write when the moment came, and I had not been certain when I promised it that I would ever get to write them. Equal terms. Then I went to find something to eat that was not a protein block, and I was successful, which I considered a better ending to the day than I had planned for. Tomorrow there was more work. There was always more work. I was exactly the kind of person who found that comforting rather than exhausting, which was probably why I had been given the job. I had never minded the work. I had only minded doing it from a folding chair. That was over now. We were building something that the next person who came after me would not need to sit in a folding chair to do. That was the point. That had always been the point. The stars outside the viewport did not acknowledge any of this. They were stars, and they had been there longer than any of us, and would be there longer than any of what we were building. But they were also there on the night the Meridian Dawn crossed the Kalari Passage, and they were there now, and the fact that what happened in between was different from what was happening now was, in the end, entirely the work of people who had decided not to accept that nothing could change. Nothing changes until someone decides it should, and then does the work. I had done the work. We had done the work. And the galaxy, whatever it thought of us this week, was not exactly what it had been last week. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was, as a matter of plain fact, everything. I sent the final diplomatic report 3 hours later, when the station's night cycle had deepened and the corridors outside were carrying only the quiet traffic of the overnight shift. The report was, by the standards of formal diplomatic communication, unusually short. Clara Adeyemi liked short reports. She had told me this in our first briefing, 11 years ago. Give me the facts and the implications, and your assessment of next steps. If I need more, I will ask. She never asked. I had learned to read that as a form of trust. The trust of a person who has reviewed enough detailed work to know when the short version is adequate, because the long version has already been done. The facts were: first, Accord session complete. 2 agenda items resolved. 2 in progress. 11 member species engaged and constructive. Audit transmitted to Compact Executive Committee. Infrastructure recalibration proposals moving to Technical Working Group. New communication protocols for 3 member species operational. 5 remaining under development. The implications were, the Accord is functional as a body, and will be more functional in 6 months than it is now. The Compact's internal conversation is changing, slowly, but the audit sharing has accelerated that process in ways that are visible in the language of the communications we are receiving. 3 inner ring species have made informal inquiries about joint infrastructure projects. These are early signals, not commitments. My assessment of next steps was a paragraph that covered the next 6 weeks, and a sentence about the next 6 months, that said simply, build steadily. Do not rush the expansion. Let the structure demonstrate itself before extending it. Clara acknowledged the report 40 minutes later with, understood. The infrastructure audit got coverage here. Good coverage. Sleep. I went to sleep. 6.5 hours this time. I was recovering the deficit from the previous 2 weeks. When I woke, the station was in its artificial morning, and on my data pad were 43 new communications, and a message from Owen that said, I have sorted these. Most can wait. 3 cannot. I will bring coffee. Owen arrived 8 minutes later, with 2 cups from the synthesizer, and a data pad summary that was, as always, precise and well organized. He had been with me for 6 years. In that time, he had learned that I preferred my briefings without editorial commentary unless I specifically asked for it, that I would tell him if I needed something that was not on the agenda, and that the most useful thing he could do when a situation was uncertain was to continue being precise and organized while I figured out the uncertain part. He had understood all of this without being told, which was why he had lasted 6 years in a role that 8 people who did not understand it. We went through the 3 urgent communications. One was a formal request from a compact outer ring species for observer status at the Accord's next session. The first such request and a sign of the kind of early movement I had expected but not yet received. Observer status was not membership, but it was a door being opened. We would consider it at the next session. I asked Owen to send a welcoming acknowledgement that confirmed the request was received without committing to a timeline, because welcomeness without urgency was the right register. The second was from the Kalari government. This was the most significant of the 3, and I read it twice and then a third time, because the language was careful in a way that careful language becomes when someone has spent considerable time deciding what to say and how. The Kalari had not been in the Accord session. They had not been among the 14 who followed me out of the chamber. They had voted with the inner ring majority on the sanction resolution, and in the corridor conversation afterward they had remained inside. They were not aligned with us. They were also, as their message made plain, aware of what alignment meant in the current state of things, and they were reaching out, not to join the Accord, but to request a bilateral conversation with Earth specifically. The message's final line said, in Council Standard, that I was certain they had revised several times. We believe there are matters between our peoples that have not been adequately addressed, and that the present moment may represent an opportunity to address them, if Earth is willing. I sat with that line for a long time. The Kalari incident was 61 years ago. The Council's resolution had closed it officially, and done nothing actually. The Kalari government of 61 years ago was not the government now. There had been 3 full changes of administration, significant internal political shifts, 2 generations of population. The beings who had made the decision that ended the Meridian Dawn were not alive. Many of the beings who had been alive when it happened were not alive. The weight of it did not go away with their passing, but weight distributed across 61 years and 3 political generations has a different character than weight that is immediate. I was not naive about what the Kalari wanted from a bilateral conversation. They wanted, in some form, to establish that they were not permanently on the wrong side of the current realignment of galactic politics. That was a reasonable thing to want, and a practical reason for reaching out, and it was probably more honest than many of the other reasons species reach out in moments of shifting power. It was also possibly the beginning of something harder and more important, an actual accounting between 2 peoples for an event that had never been accounted for, not a performance of accountability, not the elegant language of the Council's Joint Navigation Review. A real conversation about what had happened and what, if anything, could be done about the fact that it had happened. I did not know if the Kalari were ready for that conversation. I knew that Earth would need to be ready for it regardless, and that being ready meant neither demanding more than the situation could produce, nor accepting less than the situation required. I wrote back a response that took me 40 minutes to draft, and was 3 sentences long. The 3 sentences said, Earth acknowledges the Kalari government's communication. Earth is willing to meet. Earth suggests that the agenda for the initial meeting be agreed in advance, in writing, by both parties, so that both sides arrive with clarity about what the conversation is intended to address. Owen read the draft. He nodded once, which was his highest form of approval. I sent it. The 3rd urgent communication was from the station's catering department, which wanted to know if the Accord's standing food order for sessions should continue to include the warm bread tasting item from the shared Karathi Thresi menu, as they were having difficulty sourcing one of the ingredients. I sent back, yes, please continue sourcing it. It was, for reasons that had nothing to do with diplomacy and everything to do with the strange comfort of a familiar taste in an unfamiliar place, the best thing on the station's catering menu, and I intended to advocate for its continued availability with the same commitment I brought to everything else. Owen was kind enough not to comment on this. The morning moved into midday and then into afternoon, in the way of working days that are full but not chaotic, a productive rhythm that I had learned to recognize as the sign of a process that was running well rather than running past itself. More communications. 2 meetings, both scheduled and both shorter than their allotted time because the people involved were prepared and direct. A long working session with the communication protocols team, at the end of which we had resolved the 4th of the 5 remaining interspecies gaps. 1 remaining. We would get there. Late in the day, I walked to the viewpoint in the Accord's corridor. The stars were the same as they had always been. The view was the same. I was not the same. 11 years older than when I arrived, considerably tireder, doing work that looked different from the outside than it felt from the inside, carrying a weight of history and outcome that I was learning to wear as a coat rather than a burden. Someone came and stood beside me. It was the Charathi elder. He had been at the station for the full week since the signing, handling the administrative transition with the methodical patience that I had come to expect from him and to be grateful for. He was old enough to have attended sessions of the Compact before Earth had been a member. That was a fact I kept returning to, because it meant something about the view from where he was standing. He said, I have spent this week thinking about the 41 years. I did not need to ask what he meant. The navigation data, I said. Yes, 41 years of unofficial cooperation. I was not the administrator who began it. I inherited it when I came into my current role, 23 years ago. I continued it because it seemed correct, and because, to be direct, we expected that Earth would eventually be worth cooperating with officially, and the informal cooperation was building trust toward that official relationship, a very long investment. We are not a species that values short investments, he said. We find them unsatisfying. A pause. I did not know, when I inherited the arrangement, that the official cooperation would come through something like this week. I expected it would come through a slower process, a gradual shift of status within the compact structure, a longer climb from the outer ring. You did not expect us to walk out. I expected Earth to have the capacity for it, he said. I was not certain you would use the capacity. The capacity and the willingness to use it are different things. I have observed, over a long career, that many species develop power without developing the willingness to exercise it in ways that are decisive and potentially costly. The fear of the cost overrides the recognition that the cost of inaction is larger. I thought about that. We were afraid, I said. Earth was afraid for a long time. The decision to build the fleet, rather than continue complying with census requirements, was made by people who had decided the fear of what might happen to us was larger than the fear of what we might have to do. Yes, he said. That is when things change. When the fear of what is happening becomes greater than the fear of what changing it might require. He was quiet for a moment. I think you were afraid this week. Yes, I said. Not because it was something I felt comfortable saying, but because it was true, and he was a person who appreciated truth over performance. Different fears at different points. In the chamber, the fear of being wrong about what was possible. In the corridor, the fear of whether anyone would follow. In the negotiation, the fear that we had misjudged what the council was willing to accept. But you continued. You continue or you stop, I said. Stopping was also a choice with consequences. I had made the assessment that the consequences of stopping were worse. He made a sound I had not heard from him before, low and steady and sustained, which I read, based on what I knew of Charathi vocal expression, as something like, "That is the essential thing," said plainly. We stood together for another minute, watching the stars. Then he said he should return to his office, and I said goodnight, and he left, and I stood alone at the viewport for a few more minutes, before deciding that stars, however permanent and however significant as context, are not an actionable item, and there were actionable items remaining on my list. I went back to work. The Kalari replied 2 days later, 3 sentences accepting the terms of the initial meeting format. We scheduled it for the following month. The 4th of the remaining communication protocol gaps closed the day after that. 1 remaining. The Accord's second session, 6 weeks after the first, welcomed its 12th member, and then its 13th. The folding chair remained in my quarters, leaned against the wall. I had kept it. I did not entirely know why. Perhaps because objects that have carried you through something difficult deserve to be kept. Perhaps because I wanted to be able to look at it when I needed to remember what had been true before it became different. Perhaps just because it was a perfectly serviceable folding chair, and there was no good reason to throw it away. The galaxy did not change overnight. It never does. What happened was that it changed direction, slightly, then more, then steadily. The way bodies in motion change direction when the force applied to them is patient and consistent, and does not give up when the change is not immediately visible. We applied the force. We continued applying it. The direction changed. That was the work. That was what the work was. I was glad to have done it, and gladder still to have more to do.